Silas Crawford looked Vivian Hartley up and down, the way a man inspects a horse he's already decided not to buy. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't offer water after her 3-day journey. He stood behind his desk in that oversized parlor, mahogany furniture, mounted elk head, the whole performance of wealth, and he said it with the flat certainty of a man who had never once questioned himself. "You're too independent. A woman like you would argue with everything I say. I need a wife, Miss Hartley, not a business partner. 26 years old, 12 days on a train, every dollar she owned spent on the ticket and the boarding house." And that was his verdict, delivered in under 2 minutes. Vivian didn't cry. She wanted to. But she didn't. If this story makes you stop and think, what would I have done? Then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories we tell, and hit that like button right now. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to 1876, to the Colorado mountains, and to the woman who had just been thrown away. The boarding house where Vivian was staying sat at the end of Black Ridge's Main Street, sandwiched between a dry goods store and a livery stable that smelled exactly the way you'd expect. The room cost 40 cents a night. She had enough money left for 11 more nights, maybe 12 if she skipped supper on a few of them. She sat on the edge of the bed and counted the bills again. Not because the count would change. She counted them because her hands needed something to do while her mind worked through the problem. The problem was substantial. She had come to Black Ridge, Colorado territory in the spring of 1876 on the basis of a letter. 3 letters, actually, exchanged over 4 months with a man named Silas Crawford, who had described himself as a successful mine owner seeking a wife of good character and practical intelligence. He had specifically mentioned in his second letter that he admired women who could manage household accounts and make sensible decisions. Vivian had taken that to mean he wanted a capable partner. She had been wrong about what he meant. What Silas Crawford had meant, as became clear in that 10-minute meeting in his parlor, was that he wanted a woman who could balance a household ledger without bothering him about it. He wanted competence in the background. Invisible, useful, quiet. The moment he realized Vivian had opinions about mining contracts and had actually read the territorial land laws before arriving, something behind his eyes closed like a shutter. "Too independent," he had said, as if it were a medical diagnosis. Vivian put the money back in the small leather pouch she kept inside her dress. She had learned that from her mother. Keep your money close. Keep your face calm, and never let a man see you calculating your next move. Her mother had been a school teacher in Boston who married a man who died of fever when Vivian was 9, leaving her to raise 2 children on $30 a month and whatever her sharp mind could arrange. Vivian had grown up watching her mother negotiate with landlords, manage a household on nothing, and teach other people's children arithmetic while helping her own children understand that the world would not simply hand them safety. You built it, you thought your way to it, or you went without. Vivian had a gift for numbers, not just the mechanical kind, not just addition and subtraction, but the kind of numerical thinking that let her look at a column of figures and feel, somewhere in her chest, when something was wrong. Her mother had noticed it early. Her teachers had noticed it. The accounting firm where she'd worked for 3 years in Boston had noticed it too, right up until they decided that a woman in that position made the clients uncomfortable, and they'd let her go with a polite letter and 2 weeks of wages. That was 6 months before the advertisement in the Boston Herald. Silas Crawford, mine owner, Black Ridge, Colorado territory, seeking a wife of good character and practical intelligence. She had thought, Colorado territory, a new place, a different kind of man. She had been wrong about the man. She wasn't sure yet about the place. The next morning, she walked the length of Black Ridge's Main Street because she needed to understand what she was dealing with. The town was small but not dying, she could see that much. There was real commerce happening. The dry goods store had a line of customers at 8 in the morning. The assay office had 2 men waiting outside with sample bags. A freight wagon loaded with timber was pulling up toward the north road that she'd been told led to the mines. Black Ridge existed because of silver and coal pulled out of the mountains above it. She'd read about mining towns before coming out here, and she'd expected something rougher. The town had a newspaper. It had a schoolhouse, though the windows needed replacing. It had a telegraph office, which meant it was connected to the wider world in a way that mattered. What it didn't have, as far as she could tell, was any kind of work for a woman who wasn't interested in cooking or sewing. She was standing in front of the telegraph office, considering whether to wire her sister in Boston. What would she even say when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her? "You're the woman." Crawford turned away. She turned. The man standing there was tall in the way that comes from actual height, rather than boots and posture. He wore a battered hat with a crease down the center, a leather coat that had seen several winters, and boots that had clearly been resoled at least twice. His face was weathered. Not old, maybe 35, but marked by outdoor work the way a fence post gets marked by weather. There was a scar along his jaw, faint, from something that had happened long enough ago that he'd stopped noticing it. He was watching her with the kind of directness that wasn't quite rude but was definitely not performing politeness either. "I don't know you," Vivian said. "Elias Mercer." He didn't offer his hand immediately. "I own Blackstone Mine, up the North Road about 4 miles. I heard you were in town. Word travels fast in Black Ridge." Crawford's housekeeper has a sister who works at the telegraph office. He said it without apology. By yesterday afternoon, most people with business sense knew he'd rejected a woman who came out from Boston. The part that interested me was what Harding at the assay office said. "I don't know anyone named Harding. He was on the train with you from Denver. Said you spent 6 hours asking him questions about silver extraction yields and cross-referencing his answers with figures you pulled from a notebook." Vivian looked at him. "That was a private conversation. Harding's a talker." Elias Mercer shifted his weight slightly, which she was starting to read as something he did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "I've got a problem at my mine. My bookkeeper quit 3 weeks ago, and my former clerk, a man named Bennett Rusk, has been managing the accounts in the interim. Something's wrong with the numbers. I can feel it, but I can't prove it because I'm better with rock than I am with ledgers." He paused. "I'm not offering marriage. I want to be clear about that up front." "Good," Vivian said, "because I've had enough of that conversation for 1 week." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like an acknowledgement. "I'm offering a position, account manager for Blackstone, $60 a month, room in the company boarding house, and access to all the books. Full access. No one tells you what you can't look at." $60 a month was twice what she'd made at the accounting firm in Boston. The full access clause was the part that made her breath catch, though she kept that off her face. "What happens if I find something?" she asked. "Depends what it is. What if it's criminal?" He didn't hesitate. "Then we deal with it the right way. I don't protect thieves." Vivian looked out at the street. A woman was crossing in front of the freight wagon, pulling a child by the hand, moving fast. The mountains behind the town were enormous and cold-looking, even in May. Everything about this place was harder than Boston. The air was thinner, the ground was rougher, the men were louder, and the silences between things felt wider. She thought about the 11 nights she had left in the boarding house. She thought about her sister's small apartment in Boston and how much she did not want to arrive there with her hat in her hand. "When would I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing." She looked back at him. He was watching her with that same direct attention, not trying to charm her, not performing confidence, just waiting. "I'll need to see the books before I agree to anything," she said. "I'm not signing on to clean up a disaster without knowing how bad the disaster is." "Fair. And I'll need it in writing, the position, the salary, the access. Also fair." "Today," she added, "before I unpack anything at the company boarding house." He almost smiled then. It didn't quite make it to his face, but she could see the effort. "Come to my office at 3 o'clock. I'll have something written up." She nodded once, and he tipped his hat, a gesture so automatic she suspected he didn't know he did it, and walked away up the street. Vivian stood there for a moment, watching him go. She had arrived in Colorado territory expecting one kind of future. That future had collapsed in 10 minutes in Silas Crawford's parlor. This was something else entirely, and she did not know yet whether it was better or worse. What she knew was that it was real, an actual salary, an actual problem, an actual desk to sit at. She was not a woman who turned away from real work. At 3 o'clock, she walked into Elias Mercer's office above the freight depot and found him already there, sitting behind a desk covered in papers, talking to a man she didn't know. He introduced the man as Walt Dunning, his mine foreman, a stocky, red-faced Pennsylvanian who looked at Vivian with an expression that landed somewhere between skeptical and carefully neutral. Elias had a written agreement ready. She read every line. Twice. He watched her read it and didn't rush her. She found one clause she wanted changed. The termination terms gave him 30 days to end the arrangement, but gave her only 15, and she said so. "Equal terms," she said. 30 days for both of us, or 15 for both? Walt Dunning looked at Elias. Elias picked up the pen and changed the clause without comment. Then he signed it and pushed it across the desk. Vivian signed it. She started the next morning. The Blackstone Company boarding house was a 2-story wood frame building that housed a rotating population of miners, engineers, and whoever else Elias Mercer needed close to the operation. Vivian was given a room on the second floor that had a window facing east, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk. Someone had put a lamp on the desk. She suspected it was the housekeeper, a quiet Cornish woman named Mrs. Penna, who showed Vivian to the room without ceremony, but had made sure there was fresh water in the pitcher. The mine's accounting office was a separate room off the main operations building, which sat at the base of the mountain where the main shaft went in. Vivian arrived at 7 in the morning and found the office locked. She waited. At 7:20, a man arrived. Young, maybe 22, with restless eyes and ink stains on his fingers. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Hartley?" He said it like a question, though presumably he already knew the answer. "Yes, and you're Mr. Rusk." Bennett Rusk unlocked the door and let her in. The office was small and smelled of candle wax and something slightly musty, the way papers smell when they've been stored in a damp room. There were 4 wooden filing cabinets, a large central desk with 2 chairs, and a wall of shelves holding ledger books going back, she guessed, at least 3 years. "Mr. Mercer said you'd be taking over the accounts," Rusk said. I was already moving to the desk, pulling a stack of ledgers to one side as if creating a boundary. "That's right. I've been managing them for 3 weeks. Everything's in order." She looked at him. Something about the way he said it, too flat, too quick, made her file the statement away. "I'm sure it is," she said pleasantly. "I'll need the last 12 months of payroll ledgers, the supply contracts, and the production reports, to start." Rusk hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he nodded and began pulling books from the shelves. Vivian took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the door, and sat down. She started reading. By noon, she had found the first discrepancy. It was small, a payroll entry for a worker named Morales that appeared twice in the same week with slightly different amounts, the kind of error that looked like a clerical mistake. Except when she cross-referenced it with the supply ledger, there was a corresponding entry for a hardware order that, when she checked the dates, had been placed 3 days before the hardware supplier had actually arrived in Black Ridge, according to the freight record she'd requested from Walt Dunning that morning. She wrote the discrepancy in her own notebook, said nothing to Rusk. By 3 in the afternoon, she had found 6 more anomalies. By the end of the first day, she had identified what she was fairly certain was a systematic pattern, not random errors, but a deliberate method. Someone had been inflating supply costs and skimming the difference. Someone had been running ghost payroll entries, workers whose wages existed on paper but who had never been paid in full, the remaining amount redirected somewhere else. The someone, based on the handwriting, the timing, and the internal logic of the manipulation, was almost certainly Bennett Rusk. She didn't confront him. She went back to her room, ate supper at the company table without saying much, and started planning. The problem with confronting a thief directly, especially one who'd had 3 weeks unsupervised, was that confrontation gave him time to destroy evidence. She needed to build a complete picture first. She needed to work backward through every manipulated entry and reconstruct the original numbers. She needed documentation that was airtight before anyone said a word to Rusk. This was going to take time she'd have to steal in pieces, working around him. Elias Mercer found her in the accounting office at 8 that evening. She'd stayed after Rusk left, working by lamplight, spreading 3 ledgers across the desk and making notes in her own hand. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then, "You don't quit early." "I found something on the first day," she said without looking up. "I need more time before I can tell you how bad it is." He came in and sat in the chair across from her. He didn't demand details. He didn't tell her to slow down. He just sat there for a moment, watching her work, and then asked quietly, "Is it Rusk?" She looked up. "What makes you say that?" "He came to me 2 weeks ago asking for a raise. Said he was doing the work of 2 men. Elias's voice was level. I've been in mining long enough to know that when a man who handles other people's money starts asking for more of his own, there's usually a reason. I can't tell you anything definitive yet. I need another week. Take what you need. She held his gaze for a moment. He meant it. She could tell the difference by now between men who said take what you need and meant. I'll be back in 2 days asking for results, and men who actually meant the words they said. She was beginning to suspect Elias Mercer was the second kind, though she'd reserved judgment on that for a while longer. There are other things I've noticed, she said, beyond the financial irregularities, such as, your Chinese and Mexican workers are being paid at a lower rate than your other workers for the same jobs, not by a little, by a third in some cases. Something moved across his face. I didn't set those rates. I know. The rate differential appears in Rusk's records, and the difference between what they're recorded as earning and what the comparable white workers earn doesn't show up in any official rate sheet I can find, which means either someone established that policy verbally or Rusk created it on his own as an additional skimming mechanism, taking the difference for himself and paying the workers even less than their official rate. Elias was quiet for a moment. You think he's been stealing from the minority workers specifically? I think it's possible. I need to verify it by talking to the workers directly, which will require someone they trust to translate. Daniel Chen, he said immediately. He's one of the engineers, speaks Cantonese and some Spanish. He's been here 3 years and the men trust him. Can you arrange a meeting? Tomorrow evening. She nodded and looked back at the ledgers. She heard him stand up. Miss Hartley. She looked up again. The man who rejected you, Elias said carefully. Crawford. He's going to hear that you're working here. He has people at the freight office and the assay office. He'll hear about it. I know. He's not going to like it. I imagine not. Elias studied her for a moment. He's the kind of man who turns personal displeasure into a public campaign. I want you to be prepared for that. She had thought about this already, lying in her narrow bed the night before. She'd thought about what it would mean to be known in Black Ridge as the woman Crawford had rejected, now working for his apparent rival. She'd thought about the stories that might start circulating, the kind designed to make her position seem improper or her judgment suspect. I appreciate the warning, she said, but I've been managing other people's opinions of me since I was 9 years old. I'm not going to stop doing the work because someone might talk. He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded once and walked out. She turned back to the ledgers. Over the next 10 days, the picture assembled itself with the slow, ugly clarity of a developing photograph. Bennett Rusk had been stealing from Blackstone Mine for at least 14 months. The total amount, as best Vivian could calculate across the payroll manipulation, the inflated supply invoices, and the wage theft from the Chinese and Mexican workers, was somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000. $5,000 was not a trivial sum. It was the kind of money that could ruin Blackstone's operating reserves if the mine hit a difficult stretch, and mining operations always hit difficult stretches. She met with Daniel Chen on the second evening in the operations building after the day shift had cleared out. He was a compact, serious man in his early 30s who listened to her lay out what she'd found with the focused attention of an engineer examining a failed timber joint. When she explained the wage differential, his jaw tightened. I suspected, he said quietly. Some of the men tried to compare notes, but Rusk always had explanations. Said the rates were set by Mr. Mercer. Said the men on the Chinese crew were doing less dangerous work. His voice was controlled, but barely. They were doing the same work, sometimes worse. I know. What happens to the money? The stolen wages? I don't know yet where it went. I'm working on it. He looked at the papers she'd spread on the table. You can prove this? I can reconstruct the original figures with enough clarity that a reasonable examiner could verify it. Yes. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the men won't come forward on their own. They're afraid of losing their positions. I'm not asking them to come forward. I'm asking you to tell me if my wage calculations match what they actually received, privately. No names in any document unless someone volunteers. He agreed. Between Chen's information and her own reconstruction, the wage theft picture became clear enough to present by the end of the second week. Vivian put together a complete report, 41 pages, handwritten, with cross-referenced ledger citations for every finding. She brought it to Elias on a Wednesday morning and set it on his desk. He read it, All of it. She sat across from him and waited, which was not easy but was necessary. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Rusk needs to be confronted," he said. "Yes, but not today. Today you need to get a lawyer who can advise you on how to handle this in a way that protects your ability to recover some of the money and prosecute if you choose to. If Rusk is confronted without legal preparation, he'll run, and the evidence becomes a story rather than a case." Elias looked at her. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about it for 10 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's also the question of the investor." She had been waiting for this. "The Hamilton Group. They're sending a representative in 6 weeks. If Blackstone's books show a $4,000 hole and an active fraud investigation, the investment deal collapses." "The books won't show that," Vivian said. "I've been rebuilding the ledgers from the original documents. By the time the Hamilton representative arrives, the accounts will reflect the actual financial position of the mine, which, once you remove the theft, is considerably healthier than the numbers Rusk was showing." He stared at her. "You can rebuild 4 years of accounts in 6 weeks. I've been working on it for 2 weeks already. I have 4 weeks left. Yes. You'd be working 14-hour days. I've done it before." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the report on his desk. Outside, she could hear the shift bell ringing, the sound of boots on the packed dirt path to the shaft entrance. The mine was always moving, always demanding something. She was beginning to understand that Elias Mercer lived inside that constant demand the way some people live inside a weather system, always reading it, always adjusting. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I hired you at $60 a month. That was appropriate for a bookkeeper. What you've produced in 2 weeks is not bookkeeper work." She waited. "I'd like to renegotiate the terms." "I'm listening." $80 a month, he said, "and a 1% share of net production profits going forward, calculated quarterly, paid as long as you're with Blackstone." 1% of net production at a mine the size of Blackstone, based on the production report she'd been reading, was potentially significant, particularly if the operation expanded as the Hamilton investment would allow. She thought about it for exactly the amount of time it deserved. 2%, she said, "and the monthly salary stays at 80. He looked at her. "You said yourself it's not bookkeeper work," she said. 2% is the rate for the actual work, not the title." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 1.5. "Done." They shook hands across the desk. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who treated agreements as real things. Vivian went back to the accounting office. She picked up her pen. She had 4 weeks and a great deal of work to do. She did not think about Silas Crawford and his parlor and his 10-minute verdict. She thought about the ledgers. She thought about the 41 pages of meticulous, careful, airtight documentation sitting on Elias Mercer's desk. She thought, too independent. And then she started working. The lawyer Elias brought in from Denver was a man named Aldous Fitch, small, precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who had spent 20 years watching men destroy themselves through impatience. He arrived on a Thursday, read Vivian's 41-page report in a single sitting, and said almost nothing until he reached the last page. Then he set it down, removed his glasses, and said, "Miss Hartley, this is one of the most thorough pieces of financial documentation I have seen produced outside a federal audit. Who taught you to build a case like this?" "Nobody," she said. "I just followed what the numbers were telling me." Fitch looked at Elias. "You need to keep this woman." Elias said, "I know." The plan Fitch laid out was careful and methodical, which suited Vivian's thinking exactly. They would not confront Rusk directly. Not yet. Instead, Elias would inform Rusk that the company was conducting a routine account review in preparation for the Hamilton investor visit. Nothing alarming, nothing accusatory, just standard procedure. During that review period, Rusk would be asked to provide supporting documentation for every supply order placed in the last 18 months. The request would seem bureaucratic. It would also be impossible for Rusk to fulfill honestly, because several of those supply orders had no legitimate documentation. They existed only as ledger entries pointing to money that had quietly walked out the door. "If he produces forged documents," Fitch said, "we have additional criminal exposure on top of the theft itself. If he produces nothing, we have the theft alone. Either way, We build from a position of complete information. And the workers he underpaid? Vivian asked. Fitch looked at her carefully. That's more complicated. Wage theft claims in the territory require a court proceeding, and courts in Colorado Territory are not always, he paused, choosing words, consistent, especially when the claimants are Chinese or Mexican workers. I understand the political reality, Vivian said. I'm asking what we can actually do. What you can do immediately, without a court proceeding, is issue supplemental payments to correct the wage differential. As a business decision. No admission of liability, no public announcement, just a quiet correction to the records and a payment to each affected worker. The amount I've calculated comes to roughly $640 across the affected workers, she said, over the 14-month period. Fitch looked at Elias again. Can Blackstone absorb that? Yes, Elias said, without hesitating. Vivian had not been sure he would say that. She had expected some negotiation, some instinct to minimize the amount or delay the payment. Instead, he said it the way he said most things, flat, final, already decided. She made a note. Rusk's reaction to the documentation request was exactly what she had predicted, which did not make it pleasant to watch. He came to her office the morning after Elias delivered the news, and he stood in the doorway with that particular quality of stillness that frightened people carry when they are trying to look calm. I understand there's to be a review, he said. That's right. She didn't look up from the ledger she was working in. I'll need the supporting invoices for all supply orders placed between January of '75 and the present. Original copies where you have them, copies otherwise. That's a significant amount of paperwork. It is. She looked up now. I'd suggest starting with the hardware and timber orders. Those tend to have the clearest paper trails. His eyes moved, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, toward the filing cabinet in the corner, then back to her. I'll get started on it. I'd appreciate it by end of next week. He left. She waited until she heard his boots on the path outside, then went to the filing cabinet he'd glanced at and opened the bottom drawer. Nothing appeared disturbed. She made a mental note of exactly how each folder sat in the drawer, how the papers were positioned, and went back to her desk. She told Daniel Chen that afternoon to quietly inform the Chinese workers that supplemental payments would be coming within 2 weeks, privately, with no requirement to speak to anyone about it. She told him to make clear that the payments were a correction of an error, not a favor, and that no one was expected to feel grateful, just informed. Chen looked at her for a long moment after she said that. Most people don't put it that way. It's the accurate way, she said. The money is theirs. It was always theirs. He nodded, then quietly. Some of the men have been here 3 years. They've never had anyone speak to them the way you just spoke. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. It sat in her chest in a complicated way. She moved on. The 4 weeks she had to rebuild Blackstone's books were not glamorous. They were not the kind of work that produced visible results on a daily basis. It was the kind of labor that looked, from outside, like a woman sitting alone in a small office writing numbers and ledgers hour after hour, while the mind banged and rumbled around her. Mrs. Penna brought her coffee in the evenings without being asked. Walt Dunning, who had been carefully skeptical of her from the beginning, started stopping by around 5 o'clock to drop off the daily production tallies rather than leaving them on the operations desk, which she understood to mean he had decided she was worth the extra 30 steps. She made mistakes. 3 times she had to go back and recalculate an entire payroll quarter because she'd used the wrong base rate. Once she spilled coffee across an entire page of reconstructed figures and spent an hour recopying it, furious with herself in a way that had nowhere to go. She worked until 10 or 11 most nights and woke at 6 because her mind started turning whether she wanted it to or not. On the 15th day, she found something she hadn't been looking for. She had been working through the production reports, the records of how much ore the mine had extracted each month, and cross-referencing them against the mill processing records to verify that the reported tonnage matched what had actually been processed. It was routine verification work, the kind of thing you did because you did it, not because you expected to find anything interesting. But there was a discrepancy, not in Rusk's records this time. In the production reports themselves, which predated Rusk's tenure and were in a different hand entirely. Someone who had been at Blackstone before Rusk, before even the current mine foreman, over a period of 8 months, ending about 2 years ago, The production report showed extraction figures roughly 12% lower than what the mill records indicated had actually been processed. 12% over 8 months was not rounding error. 12% over 8 months, at Blackstone's production volume, was a significant amount of ore that had been extracted, processed, and apparently not fully accounted for in the official records. She sat with this for a long time. It could mean several things. It could mean the old record keeper had made consistent errors in the same direction for 8 months, which was possible but unlikely. It could mean there had been a deliberate effort to underreport production, possibly for tax purposes, or possibly to hide the true value of the mine from someone. Or it could mean something she hadn't thought of yet. She did not bring this to Elias immediately. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she presented it, because presenting it wrong, presenting it as a question when it turned out to be an error, or presenting it as an error when it turned out to be a question, would undermine the precision she'd spent 3 weeks establishing. She went to Walt Dunning instead. He was in the equipment shed, examining a drill bit with the focused attention he brought to all mechanical things. She waited until he'd set it down before speaking. "Mr. Dunning, can I ask you something about the production records from 2 years ago?" He looked at her. "What about them?" "There are 8 months where the extraction figures appear to be significantly lower than what the mill processed. I'm trying to understand if there's a technical explanation I'm missing, some aspect of how production is measured at the shaft level versus what arrives at the mill." He was quiet for a moment. He scratched the back of his neck, which she was beginning to recognize as his version of buying time. 2 years ago, he said. That would be around when Crawford was making his first run at buying us out. She kept her expression neutral. Go on. Elias didn't want Crawford to know how much ore we were pulling. Crawford was using our production numbers to calculate an offer price, trying to lowball us by claiming Blackstone was declining. Dunning said it without any particular embarrassment, just factually, the way you explained something that seemed reasonable at the time. So Elias reported lower figures to the territorial office for 8 months, just enough to muddy the picture. Vivian was quiet for a moment. He underreported to the territorial office. To Crawford's people specifically. Crawford had a man at the territorial office. Dunning looked at her steadily. I know how it sounds, but Crawford was trying to steal the mine. He'd have paid us a quarter of what it was worth and called it generous. She walked back to the accounting office and sat down at the desk. She looked at the wall for a while. This was a problem. Not a catastrophic one. The underreporting had been strategic rather than financial theft, and it was 2 years in the past, and the motivation was self-protection against a predatory buyer. But it was a problem because it existed in the records, and if the Hamilton Investor Group's representative looked closely enough, they could find it, and finding it without an explanation in place would be bad. She needed to tell Elias. She found him at the shaft entrance at the end of the day shift, talking to a crew of miners who were coming up from the 3rd level. He had a habit of being present when shifts ended. Not managing, just present. She'd noticed it in the first week. The men seemed to appreciate it in the quiet way people appreciate things they don't talk about. She waited until the last of the crew had passed. I need to speak with you, she said. Privately. He looked at her. Something in her face told him it wasn't good. Office, he said. In the office, she showed him the discrepancy. She showed him where it appeared in the production reports, how it compared to the mill records, and what the math worked out to. Then she told him what Dunning had told her. He sat back in his chair. He didn't deny it. I should have told you about that when I hired you, he said. Yes. I thought it was buried deep enough that a routine review wouldn't surface it. I'm not doing a routine review, she said, and neither will the Hamilton Group's representative. He rubbed his jaw. The scar there caught the lamplight for a moment. What do you want to do with it? I want to disclose it, proactively. In the investor materials, with a full explanation of the circumstances, and the fact that it's been 2 years with no repetition. She paused. Hiding it and having them find it is fatal to the deal. Disclosing it with context gives us some control over the narrative. He looked at her. Crawford will use it if it becomes public. He'll tell everyone I falsified territorial records. You did falsify territorial records. I know that. Then Crawford will be telling the truth, she said. The question is whether the full truth, including why you did it and what Crawford was attempting at the time, is worse than the partial truth that comes out during an investigation. Elias was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered once. Outside, the mine was winding down for the night, equipment being stowed, the last of the voices fading toward the boarding house. "You could have just buried it," he said finally. "Nobody would have looked that far back." "I considered it," she said honestly, "for about 30 seconds. He looked at her differently then. Not with surprise exactly. More like he was recalibrating something. "The Hamilton materials need to be completely clean," she said. "Not just free of what I was hired to clean up. Free of everything that could become a problem. That means this too." He nodded. Slowly, but he nodded. "Write it up. Whatever you need to say, write it up, and I'll review it before it goes into the materials." She went back to her desk. She wrote 3 drafts of the disclosure paragraph before she had one that was accurate without being inflammatory, honest without being an invitation to further scrutiny. It was some of the most careful writing she had done in her professional life, which was saying something, because she had spent a considerable amount of her professional life writing carefully. 2 weeks before the Hamilton representative was due to arrive, Rusk came to her office and put a manila envelope on the desk. "The documentation you requested," he said. She opened the envelope. Inside were 12 invoices, originals. She could see from the paper and the ink, genuine documents. She looked through them without changing her expression. She had expected forgeries. What she found was more interesting. These were real invoices from real suppliers, but they had been selectively chosen. They covered 12 supply orders that had legitimate documentation. They conspicuously did not cover the 23 supply orders she knew to be problematic. Rusk had given her the clean ones and hoped she wouldn't notice what was missing. "Thank you," she said. "I'll compare these to the ledger. I'll let you know if I need anything else." He left. She sat for a moment, then pulled out the master list she'd been building of all supply orders in the review period and began marking off which ones he'd covered. It took about 15 minutes to produce a clear list of the 23 missing ones. She brought that list to Fitch that evening. Fitch looked at it and said, "He knows." "He's known for a while," she said. "He's been deciding how much he can afford to give me without giving away what he actually took." "Then we're close to the end of the rope," Fitch said. "He either runs or he tries something else." "I know," she said. "That's why I wanted to talk to you tonight." They agreed that Elias would approach Rusk the next morning and, very calmly, very professionally, inform him that the documentation review had identified 23 additional orders requiring supporting invoices and that he had until the following Monday, 5 days, to produce them. The framing would still be bureaucratic. No accusation, no confrontation, just another procedural request. The hope was that Rusk would do one of 2 things: either produce something in those 5 days that gave them more evidence, or panic and run, which would be its own kind of evidence. What they did not anticipate was the third thing. On the morning after Elias delivered the second documentation request, Rusk didn't come to the office. He didn't come in the afternoon either. At 4 o'clock, a writer came up from Black Ridge with a message that made Vivian's stomach drop. Silas Crawford had called a meeting at the Black Ridge Town Hall for the following evening. The stated subject was concerns about financial management at Blackstone Mine. The meeting was open to the public. Crawford had, according to the writer, already invited 2 members of the Territorial Land Commission. Vivian read the message twice. Then she set it on Elias's desk. He read it. His jaw tightened in a way she'd seen only once before, the day she'd shown him Rusk's full theft total. "Rusk went to Crawford," she said. "Before or after Crawford put Rusk up to it originally," Elias said, and it wasn't quite a question. She had thought about this. The timing of Rusk's appearance at Blackstone, combined with what she now understood about the sophisticated nature of the wage theft scheme, more sophisticated than a 22-year-old clerk would design on his own, suggested the possibility that Rusk had not acted alone from the beginning, that someone with more strategic thinking had set the initial architecture and pointed Rusk at Blackstone deliberately. "I don't have proof of that yet," she said carefully. "What I do have is documentation of everything Rusk took, a clear audit trail showing the money didn't go to Blackstone's legitimate operating costs, and a rebuilt set of books that will hold up to independent examination. Crawford will claim that my hiring you, a woman Crawford himself rejected, is evidence of bad judgment on my part. He'll use the personal angle." "He'll try to," she said. "What he doesn't know is that I have been building for this for 6 weeks." Elias looked at her. "What do you mean?" She pulled a folder from her desk drawer and put it in front of him. "I've been preparing a summary of Blackstone's financial position, the real position, not the manipulated one, formatted as a public document. not the investor materials. A different version, designed to be read by someone who isn't a financial professional. Clear language, specific figures, enough detail to be credible, but organized so a town hall audience can follow it. He opened the folder and looked at the first page. She watched him read. "You knew Crawford was going to do something like this," he said. "I knew he wasn't going to let it go. He's been watching me work here for 6 weeks and getting angrier about it. I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew it was coming." Elias closed the folder. He turned it over in his hands once, the way he turned things over when he was thinking. "The meeting is tomorrow evening." "Yes." "You want to attend?" "I think we both need to attend," she said. "And I think we should bring Fitch and Daniel Chen and Walt Dunning. And I think we should bring the books." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to put the actual ledgers on a table in the Black Ridge Town Hall. I want Crawford to stand up in front of 2 territorial commissioners and 30 members of this community and make accusations against books that are sitting right there for anyone to look at." She paused. "He can't lie about what's in them if they're open on the table." Elias was quiet. "He'll have Rusk," she said. "Rusk will say whatever Crawford tells him to say. But Rusk's credibility depends on what the books show, and the books will show that Rusk was the one stealing." "That's a very public confrontation," Elias said. "Yes." If it goes wrong, Blackstone loses the Hamilton deal and possibly its operating license," she said. "If we don't go and Crawford makes his case unopposed, the result is the same. So we might as well be in the room." He sat with it for a moment. She let him sit with it. She had learned that about him over the past 6 weeks. He needed a certain amount of silence to make decisions that mattered to him, and pushing into that silence produced worse decisions, not faster ones. "All right," he said, "we go." She nodded and picked up the folder. She had more preparation to do before tomorrow evening, and the night was already getting late. She was back at her desk by 7. The lamp was running low on oil, and she refilled it without breaking her reading. Outside, the mountain sat in the dark the way it always did. Enormous, indifferent, full of silver and rock, and the bones of 1,000 decisions made by men who'd come here looking for something they mostly couldn't name. She thought about her mother, briefly. About a woman who had spent her whole life being capable in rooms that didn't fully credit her for it. She thought about the school children her mother had taught arithmetic to, children who had gone on to use those skills in the world, while her mother continued teaching on $30 a month until she was too tired to stand in front of a class anymore. Vivian had promised herself, at 17, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, doing accounts for the neighborhood women who couldn't manage their own because nobody had taught them. She would never let herself be kept in a room that was smaller than her abilities. It turned out that promise was harder to keep than it sounded. The world had a lot of smaller rooms. But she was in Colorado territory now. She had 41 pages of documented financial fraud, a rebuilt set of books that would hold up to examination by anyone with eyes, a 1.5% share of net production at Blackstone Mine, and a town hall meeting tomorrow evening where a powerful man was going to try to destroy her. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. She was something closer to ready. She dipped her pen and went back to work, writing by lamplight while the mountain breathed its cold air through the thin walls, and the mine sat dark and quiet above the town, waiting. The way all things with silver in them wait, patient and heavy, and certain that what's inside will eventually come to light. The town hall was a single-story building with plank floors and windows that rattled when the wind came down from the ridge. By the time Vivian arrived the following evening with Elias, Fitch, Chen, and Dunning, there were already 40 people inside. She had not expected 40. She had expected 20, maybe 25. The extra faces made the air feel close and the lamp smoke hang lower. Crawford was at the front of the room. He had dressed carefully. Good suit, clean boots, hat in his hands, performing the role of concerned citizen with the ease of a man who had performed it many times before. Beside him sat a young man Vivian didn't recognize, thin and nervous-looking with ink stains on his right hand. Rusk. Older-looking than she remembered. Or maybe just different now that she knew what she knew about him. The 2 territorial commissioners were seated at a table to the right. Older men, patient-looking, the kind of bureaucratic patience that comes from attending many such meetings, and knowing that most of them ended with less than they promised. Elias set the ledgers on the table at the back of the room. All of them. The stack was 8 inches high. Crawford noticed. His eyes moved to the books, then to Vivian, and something in his expression tightened the way a man's face tightens when he realizes a card he thought he had isn't the card he thought it was. Vivian sat down at the table beside the ledgers. She folded her hands and waited. The meeting began. Crawford spoke for 20 minutes. He was good at it. She would give him that. His language was measured, his tone concerned rather than accusatory, and he was careful to frame everything as a question rather than a statement. He raised doubts about the recent personnel changes at Blackstone, concerns about financial management given the departure of the previous bookkeeper, and the troubling possibility, he said possibility, very carefully, that the mine's books might not accurately reflect its actual position. He produced a written statement from Rusk that raised specific questions about certain payroll entries and supply orders. When Crawford finished, the room was quiet. In the way rooms get quiet when people are uncertain whether to be worried. One of the commissioners leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, would you like to respond?" Elias stood. He said 3 sentences. That Blackstone had recently completed a thorough audit of all accounts going back 4 years. That the results of that audit were sitting on the table at the back of the room and available for examination, and that the person best positioned to explain what the audit found was the woman who had conducted it. Then he sat down and looked at Vivian. She stood up. She had thought about how to do this, not what to say. She knew exactly what the numbers said, but how to say it in a room full of people who were not accountants, who had come because they were worried or curious, or because Crawford had specifically invited them, and who needed to understand complicated financial information quickly and clearly. She picked up the public summary she'd prepared and began to speak. She did not use complicated language. She did not perform confidence. She just talked about the books the way she would talk to her mother, directly, in plain terms, starting with what was there and working through to what it meant. She was on the 3rd page of the summary when Crawford interrupted her. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice had a particular texture that she recognized. The texture of a man who has decided that the facts aren't working for him and is going to try a different approach. "I don't doubt your abilities. I simply question whether a woman with no formal credentials, who was placed in this position under somewhat irregular circumstances, Mr. Crawford." She stopped him without raising her voice. "I have the books on the table behind me. Would you like to have one of the commissioners examine them?" Crawford hesitated for exactly half a second. "Because I would welcome that," she continued. "I would actually request it. Commissioner Aldred," she turned to the older of the 2 men at the side table, "would you be willing to examine a selection of the original ledger entries against the reconstructed figures I'm presenting?" Commissioner Aldred looked somewhat startled at being addressed directly. Then he straightened and said, "I would, yes." Crawford's expression changed. It was small, just a tightening around the eyes, but she saw it. "Then let's do it," she said. "Right now, if you're willing, before we go any further." And that was the moment the meeting changed direction. Not dramatically, not the way things change in stories told afterward, just quietly, the way a current changes when the riverbed shifts beneath it. Commissioner Aldred came to the table. Vivian showed him 3 specific entries, payroll, supply, and production, and walked him through the comparison between the original documents and the reconstructed figures, and the trail from one to the other. It took 11 minutes. At the end of it, Aldred sat back and said, to the room rather than to any individual, "The figures appear to correspond." It wasn't a verdict, it wasn't an exoneration, but it was a public statement by a territorial commissioner in a room full of people that what Vivian had put in front of them held up to immediate scrutiny. Crawford tried twice more. First, he raised the question of the production report discrepancy, which meant Rusk had found it too, or had been told about it. Vivian had the disclosure paragraph ready and read it aloud, clearly, with the full context of Crawford's attempted acquisition and the fact that no similar discrepancy existed in any other period of the mine's records. Crawford had wanted to use it as a weapon and found that she'd already diffused it. His face showed a controlled frustration that was almost satisfying to watch. The second attempt was personal. He mentioned, as if in passing, that Vivian had come to Blackridge as a prospective bride and had found herself working for the man she'd been introduced to as a rival. He let the implication hang in the air. Before Elias could speak, Dunning did. Walt Dunning, who had been skeptical of her for the first 2 weeks of her employment and who had dropped off production tallies at her door every evening for the past month, stood up from the back row and said, in his flat Pennsylvania voice, "I've worked mining operations for 18 years in 3 territories. I don't think I've met a bookkeeper who knew what a drift tunnel was before Miss Hartley. She asked me the right questions on day 1, and she's asked them every day since. I don't know what her personal circumstances are, and I don't think it matters. The mine is running cleaner than it has in 2 years." He sat back down. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Crawford knew when a room had turned. He was too experienced not to feel it. He wrapped up his concerns in the language of continued vigilance and civic responsibility and sat down, and the meeting ended 20 minutes later without a resolution or a recommendation from the commissioners. Just the usual vague conclusion that all parties should continue to act in good faith. It was not a victory in the way victories are written up. There was no gavel, no verdict, no public declaration. Just people filing out into the evening air, some of them nodding to Vivian as they passed, and Crawford walking out with his jaw set and his hat pulled low. Rusk left without looking at her. Outside, Fitch caught up to her on the boardwalk and said quietly, "He'll be gone by morning." "I know," she said. "It doesn't matter. We have everything we need." Elias walked up beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was not unusual. Then, "Dunning doesn't say things he doesn't mean." "I know that too," she said. They walked back toward the mine road, the 3 of them and Chen and Dunning, in the kind of quiet that falls after a hard thing has been done well enough. Not perfectly, not the way it would have happened in a simpler story, but well enough, which was all any of it was ever going to be. The mountains above them were black against a sky that had gone deep blue at the edges, and somewhere up in the blackstone shaft, the silver was sitting in the rock the way it had always sat, patient, dense, waiting for someone willing to do the work of getting at it. Rusk was gone by morning, exactly as Fitch had predicted. He left behind an empty room at the company boarding house, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey, and a gap in the filing cabinet where the personnel records had been. Records that, fortunately, Vivian had already copied in full 3 weeks before, because she had known then that a man with something to hide doesn't leave empty-handed when he finally decides to run. The Hamilton representative arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after Rusk disappeared, which was not ideal timing, but was not catastrophic either. His name was Gerald Foss, mid-40s, trim, with the careful eyes of a man who had been lied to enough times by enough mine owners that he had developed a professional suspicion of everyone who shook his hand too eagerly. Elias did not shake his hand too eagerly. He shook it once, firmly, and then brought him to the operations building and offered him coffee, which Foss accepted, and a tour of the mine, which Foss said he'd prefer to do after he'd seen the books. Vivian was ready for that. She had spent the final 3 days before his arrival doing something she had not initially planned. She had reorganized the entire presentation of the reconstructed accounts into a format specifically designed for an outside examiner. Not just clean numbers with a visible logic chain, every figure traceable back to its source document in 3 steps or fewer. She had also prepared a 1-page executive summary, a 2-page methodology explanation, and on the last page of the package, the disclosure paragraph about the production report discrepancy, printed clearly, not buried. Foss sat down at the table in the accounting office and began reading. Vivian sat across from him and did not speak unless he asked a question, which she had learned was the correct posture with a professional examiner. People who talked too much during examinations were usually hiding something or afraid of something, and she was doing neither. He asked 12 questions over the course of 2 hours. They were good questions, the kind that went after the seams rather than the surface. She answered 11 of them directly and immediately. The 12th was about the disclosed production report discrepancy, and she answered that one the same way she'd written it, directly, with full context, without apologizing for it. Foss looked at her over the top of the page for a moment after she finished explaining. "You disclosed this voluntarily?" "Yes." "Before I arrived?" "Yes." He looked back at the page. "Most mine owners I visit would have tried to bury this." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't." He made a note. She couldn't see what the note said, but she watched him write it and felt, not confidence exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular steadiness that comes from knowing you've done the honest thing, and the honest thing is also, in this case, the smart thing, and you don't have to keep track of 2 different versions of the story. The investor meeting ran through the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, Foss had moved from the accounts to the operations side. and Elias was walking him through the mine itself, into the mountain, down the main shaft, into the working tunnels where the silver came out of rock under the hands of men who knew exactly where to strike. Vivian did not go into the mine. She stayed in the accounting office and worked on the quarterly payroll summary that was due at the end of the week, because the investor visit had pushed 3 days of regular work to the side, and the regular work did not stop for investor visits. At 6, Elias came back with Foss, and they sat in the operations building with Dunning and went over production capacity, expansion projections, and equipment needs. Vivian was not in that meeting. She was not asked to be, which she noted without dwelling on it. It was an operational discussion and Dunning's territory, and she had enough of her own territory to manage. At 7:30, Elias appeared in the doorway of the accounting office. "He wants to speak with you again." She put down her pen. "About what?" "He didn't say." She followed Elias back to the operations building. Foss was sitting at the table with his jacket off, which she took as a good sign. Men in formal meetings kept their jackets on. He looked up when she came in and gestured to the chair across from him. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I want to ask you something outside the formal scope of the visit." "All right." The Hamilton Group is considering a significant investment in Blackstone's expansion. The expansion would involve additional tunneling, new processing equipment, and potentially a second shaft on the eastern ridge. He paused. An operation of that scale requires financial management beyond what a single account manager can provide. We would want assurances that the systems you've built here are sustainable, that they don't depend entirely on your continued presence. She understood what he was actually asking. He was asking whether, if she left, Blackstone would fall apart. "I've been building documentation procedures since my first week," she said. "Every system I've created is written down in enough detail that a competent replacement could operate it. The payroll system, the supply verification process, the production cross-referencing, none of it lives in my head. It lives in the procedures manual on that shelf." She pointed through the doorway toward the accounting office. "I can show it to you if you'd like." "That won't be necessary." He made another note. "The other thing I want to ask is about Silas Crawford." The room was quiet for a moment. Dunning shifted in his chair. Elias's expression didn't change, but she saw his right hand flatten against the table in the small way it did when he was being careful. "What about him?" she said. "Crawford's Silverton Mine is the principal competing operation in this region. His production figures have declined over the past year. His relationship with Blackstone is clearly adversarial." Foss set his pen down. "The Hamilton Group is investing in this region, not just in this mine. We need to understand whether the Crawford situation represents a manageable business rivalry or a structural threat to the operation." It was a perceptive question. She had been thinking about it herself, in the gaps between other thinking for the past several weeks. Because Foss was right, Crawford wasn't going away. The town hall meeting had not ended Crawford's interest in Blackstone. It had made him angrier, and anger in a man with resources and a grudge was a specific kind of ongoing problem. "Crawford's direct attack on our financial records failed publicly," she said. "That limits his immediate options, but he has relationships with several territorial officials that could create regulatory friction, delayed permits, additional inspection requirements, the kind of administrative pressure that doesn't make headlines but costs time and money." She paused. "The most straightforward answer to your question is that Crawford is a manageable rival as long as Blackstone continues to outperform him and maintains clean records. The moment we give him something legitimate to use, he'll use it. And the moment Blackstone expands significantly," Foss said, "the competitive pressure on Silverton increases." "Yes." Foss looked at her for a moment. "Do you have a view on how to manage that dynamic?" She glanced at Elias. He gave her nothing, not a nod, not a shake of the head. He was leaving it to her, which she'd also noticed he tended to do in situations that were genuinely unclear. "I have a view that I haven't fully worked out yet," she said honestly. "I don't think I should share a half-formed idea with a potential investor." Foss almost smiled. "I appreciate that. Most people share the half-formed ideas and dress them up." He left the next morning on the early stage back toward Denver, with a handshake for Elias and a nod for Vivian, and the promise that the Hamilton Group would have a formal response within 30 days. It was the best possible outcome for the meeting. Not a yes, but not a no, and a 30-day window that felt, based on his questions and his notes and the fact that he'd taken his jacket off, more like a formality than an actual deliberation. Vivian went back to the accounting office and sat down at the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. She was tired. Not the surface-level tired that coffee could fix, but the bone-deep tired that accumulates when you've been running at full capacity for 6 weeks without a single day where nothing required your attention. She had not taken a day off since arriving at Blackstone. She had not walked anywhere that wasn't directly related to the mine or the accounting office or the boarding house. She had not written a letter to her sister in Boston in 3 weeks, which was long enough that her sister would be worrying. She picked up her pen and started on the quarterly payroll summary. She would write the letter Sunday. Sunday turned out to be unavailable because Saturday morning the northern tunnel exploded. She heard it from the accounting office, a sound that was more felt than heard, a deep concussive thud that came up through the floor and rattled the lamp on the desk and sent a fine dust sifting down from the ceiling. For 1 full second she didn't know what it was. Then she heard the voices outside, the shift bell ringing in the wrong pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, which she had learned in her first week was the emergency signal, and she was out the door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The scene at the shaft entrance was controlled chaos, the particular kind that happens when experienced men are dealing with something terrible but have a trained response to it. Dunning was already there, barking orders in his flat Pennsylvania way, directing the off-shift crew toward the emergency equipment shed. 3 miners who had been on the surface came running from the direction of the boarding house, still pulling on their jackets. "What level?" Elias was asking Dunning. "3rd level, Northern Drift. Chen's crew was in there." Dunning's voice was steady but tight. "We had 4 men on that drift this morning." 4 men. Vivian stayed out of the way. She understood this was not her domain. But she stayed close because she needed to understand what was happening and because the instinct to know was too strong to override. Elias was already pulling on the heavy canvas jacket that the mine rescue equipment included, the one with the reinforced shoulders. He moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had done emergency response before and didn't waste motion on it. He checked a lantern, checked the rope on a coil near the shaft entrance, said something to Dunning she couldn't hear, and then he went into the mountain. Just like that. Into the smoke that was already drifting up from the shaft, into the dark, into a place where something had just exploded. Vivian stood at the shaft entrance and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear exactly, because she barely knew Elias Mercer in the way that fear for someone requires knowing them, but a kind of sharp, sudden awareness of what it would mean if he didn't come back out. The awareness of how much the whole structure of Blackstone depended on a man who was currently climbing down into a burning mine. She turned away from the shaft and went to where Dunning was organizing the surface response. "What do you need?" she said. He looked at her. "Head count. I need to know exactly who was on shift and who's accounted for on the surface." He shoved a roster board at her. "Cross-reference this against who you can see." She took the board and started moving through the crowd of miners and workers on the surface, calling names, marking them off. It was work she could do. It was concrete and necessary, and it kept her hands busy while her mind kept throwing her back toward the shaft entrance. The roster had 23 names on the 3rd-level shift. By the time she'd worked through the crowd twice, she had accounted for 19 of them. 4 were missing. 2 men from the Northern Drift crew, 1 timber framer named Olson, who'd been working near the drift entrance, and Daniel Chen. She brought the roster back to Dunning and showed him the 4 missing names. He looked at it and nodded without speaking and went back to coordinating the rescue equipment. The waiting was the worst part. She had known this abstractly, that waiting in emergencies was its own kind of labor. But knowing it abstractly and experiencing it were different things. She stayed near the shaft entrance because she needed to be there, not because being there accomplished anything. An hour and 40 minutes after the explosion, the rope signals came up from the shaft. 2 sharp tugs, then 3, which Dunning said meant they were bringing someone up. The first man they brought up was one of the drift crew, a Mexican miner named Vargas, conscious but dazed, with a cut across his forehead and dust coating everything. He was helped away by 2 of the surface crew. 10 minutes later, the second drift crew member came up, coughing hard, unable to walk without support, but alive. Then Olson, the timber framer, who was unconscious and had to be carried, and who Vivian watched be laid on a board and checked by the man who served as Blackstone's closest approximation of a doctor, a former Army field surgeon named Briggs, who worked at the mine part-time. The 4th person hadn't come up yet, Chen. Another 20 minutes passed. Dunning was at the shaft entrance, watching the rope. Vivian stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Then the rope moved and Elias came up first, pulling himself hand over hand with the systematic effort of a man running on something below the level of normal strength. He had Daniel Chen slung across his shoulders in a carry she recognized from her brother's description of rescue work. Weight distributed across the back, hands locked around the forearms, chin down. Chen was breathing. She could see his chest moving from 10 feet away, which was the first thing she checked. Briggs came forward immediately. Elias set Chen down with the careful deliberateness of someone whose muscles are threatening to give out, but who will not let them give out until the person is safely on the ground. Then he straightened, slowly, and stood there breathing for a moment with his hands on his knees. His face was black with smoke. His jacket was torn at one shoulder. When he finally stood upright, he moved toward where Briggs was working on Chen, and she saw him favor his left side. Not dramatically, not in a way he was performing, but in the small way a person moves when something hurts and they're trying not to think about it. She went to him. "You're hurt." "It's fine." "That's not an answer to what I said." He looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges from the smoke. "Rib. Maybe two. Briggs can look at it after he's done with Chen." "Are you going back down?" "No, Dunning's taking the next crew in to assess the drift." She stayed beside him while Briggs worked on Chen, not because she was needed there, but because leaving felt wrong, and she'd stopped arguing with her instincts in the past hour. Chen had a head wound, 2 broken fingers, and what Briggs called a significant concussion that would require him to stay horizontal for at least a week. He was conscious and coherent, which Briggs said was the important thing. When Briggs finished with Chen, he came to Elias and pressed on his ribs with 2 fingers in 3 places, and Elias's breath caught on the second place in a way that confirmed what he'd said. 2 ribs, Briggs concluded, not displaced. He wrapped them with the tight competence of someone who had wrapped many ribs in the field and told Elias to breathe carefully and not do anything that required twisting for 3 weeks. "The Hamilton representative just left," Elias said, almost to himself. "Good timing." "Yes," Vivian said. He looked at her sideways. "Are you all right?" "I'm not the one who went into the mine." "That's not what I asked." She looked at Chen, who was being carried on a board toward the boarding house. She looked at the shaft entrance, which was still leaking a thin thread of smoke. She thought about 4 names on a roster board and the space of time between crossing 3 of them off and the 4th. "I'll be all right," she said. Dunning came back up from his assessment of the northern drift 2 hours later with a face that told her the news before he spoke. The drift was heavily damaged. The support structure had failed, not from the explosion itself, but in a way that suggested the explosion had found existing weakness to work through. He described the pattern of the timber damage to Elias in technical terms she only partially followed, but she followed enough to understand the conclusion. This was not a clean accident. "The supports on the north wall of that drift were cut," Dunning said. "Not all the way through, just enough to weaken them. And the charge, whatever blew, it was placed where it would do the most structural damage to the weakened section. The 3 of them were in the operations building. The door was closed. The evening was coming down outside, turning the windows a deep gray blue. "Someone who knew the mine," Elias said. "Someone who'd been in that drift recently," Dunning confirmed. "The cuts in the support timbers are fresh, within the last week." Vivian had been thinking since the moment Dunning brought the rope signals up, since the moment she'd stood at the shaft entrance, understanding that 4 men were in a damaged tunnel and one of them was in there longer than the others. She'd been organizing what she knew into a sequence, the way she organized numbers, looking for the logic that connected the pieces. Rusk had left 3 days ago. He had gone somewhere, she didn't know where, and Fitch hadn't been able to locate him yet. Rusk knew the mine. He had worked in the accounting office, which was at the base of the operations building, which meant he'd walked past the shaft entrance every day for however long he'd been at Blackstone before she arrived. He might have gone into the mine himself at some point. It wasn't unusual for the accounting staff to do a walkthrough to understand operations. But the cuts in the timber were within the last week, and Rusk had left 3 days ago. "Who else had access to the northern drift in the past week?" she asked Dunning. He thought about it. "The regular crew. Chen's group. The timber framing team that was replacing the supports on the south wall. They went through the drift to get to the south side." "Outside workers?" Anyone who came in for a specific job? He frowned. Crawford sent a surveyor through 2 weeks ago, said he was doing regional mapping for the territorial office. We let him in because he had the right paperwork. The room was quiet. What was the surveyor's name? Vivian asked. Didn't deal with him directly. Olson let him through. He paused. Olson's concussed. When he wakes up, she said, I need to know what that surveyor's name was and what he looked like. Elias was looking at her. You think Crawford did this? I think Crawford has a surveyor who may have walked through our northern drift with the right paperwork 2 weeks ago. And I think we have freshly cut support timbers and a well-placed explosion, and I think those things want to be in the same room together. She kept her voice level. I don't have proof. I need Olson to be conscious, and I need to know if the territorial office actually sent a surveyor to this area in the past month. Fitch can check that, Elias said. Fitch should check it tonight, by telegraph, because if Crawford is connected to this and he thinks we're not looking in his direction, that's the last time we have the advantage of his underestimating us. Elias looked at Dunning. Dunning picked up his hat from the table. I'll get the telegraph office to hold the line open. He left. Vivian sat down because her legs were finally telling her what they'd been trying to tell her for the past 4 hours, which was that she'd been standing on adrenaline since the floor shook under her desk that morning, and the adrenaline was running out. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and put one in front of her. He sat across the table. He moved carefully, keeping his torso straight, not letting the ribs complicate his breathing. You should be in bed, she said. Later. They sat with the coffee for a moment. Outside, the mine was silent in the particular way it went silent after a bad day. Not peaceful, just exhausted. Chin's gonna be all right, Elias said. Not as a comfort, just as a statement of what he believed. Briggs seems to think so. Briggs has seen worse and been right about recovery more often than not. She looked at her coffee. The lamp on the table between them was burning low, and neither of them reached to adjust it. The Hamilton group is going to hear about this, she said. An explosion on the 3rd level, 1 man seriously injured, structural damage in the northern drift. That's exactly the kind of news that makes investors reconsider. I know. We need to get ahead of it. I can write to Foss directly. A factual account of the incident, the rescue, what we know about the cause, and what we're doing about it. If he hears it from us first, with full detail, it reads differently than if he hears it from someone else. Elias looked at her. You want to write to the investor about an explosion in our mine. I want to control what he knows and when he knows it, yes. She paused. After the town hall meeting, I'm done letting other people frame this operation story before we do. He was quiet for a moment, then, write the letter. I'll review it before it goes. The telegraph came back from Fitch at 10 that evening. The Territorial Surveying Office had no record of any survey order for the Black Ridge Mining District in the past 6 months. No surveyor had been officially dispatched to the area. The paperwork Olson had accepted was either forged or had come from a private party misrepresenting itself as territorial authority. Elias read the telegraph twice. He set it on the table between them. We need the sheriff, Vivian said. The sheriff in Black Ridge is a man named Harker. He's had dinner at Crawford's house 4 times in the past year. I know because the hotel keeps a record of events, and Harker charged 2 of those dinners to the town account. He said it without heat, just flatly. He's not independent. Then we need the territorial marshal's office, she said. Not Harker, above Harker. That takes time. I know. In the meantime, we document everything Dunning found in the drift, and we get a sworn statement from him now, before anything in that tunnel is disturbed. We document the forged survey paperwork. We get Olson's statement the moment he's coherent. She was thinking as she spoke, not planning so much as building, one piece at a time, the way she built accounts, starting from the most solid thing and working outward. And we keep all of it out of Harker's hands until we have someone who answers to something higher than Crawford's dinner table. Elias looked at the telegraph. You know that even if the marshal investigates and finds what we think is there, Crawford will deny it. He'll say Rusk acted alone, or that the surveyor was a coincidence. Probably. And we might not be able to prove otherwise. Probably not. Not in court. She met his eyes. But we don't need to prove it in court to use it. We need to know it ourselves, because knowing it changes how we respond to what comes next. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them had burned down to the point where the light was warm and close, and the rest of the room had gone dark. She was aware, in the tired, unguarded part of her mind, that this was the kind of conversation she had not expected to have with anyone in Colorado territory. The kind where both people in the room were thinking at the same speed and neither of them was performing anything for the other. "What comes next?" he asked. Not rhetorically, actually asking. "Crawford will claim the explosion proves Blackstone is mismanaged. He'll use it to pressure the Territorial Commission into an inspection. He might try to get the Hamilton deal killed." She paused. "And at some point, probably soon, he's going to make a direct move on the land. He's been trying to acquire the Eastern Ridge parcel that adjoins Blackstone since before I arrived. If he can get that parcel, he controls access to the most promising expansion route." Elias was quiet. She could see him absorbing this, fitting it into what he already knew. "Edwin Harrington owns the Eastern Ridge," he said. "Yes. And Harrington has been having financial difficulties. I noticed it in the regional property records I pulled for the investor materials. He's had 3 mortgage adjustments in 18 months, and he's behind on his territorial property fees." She had noted this 3 weeks ago and filed it away as background information. It was suddenly foreground information. If Crawford approaches Harrington with cash in hand and Harrington is desperate enough, that parcel could change hands quickly. We'd lose the expansion route. And Crawford would control the terrain between his operation and ours in a way that creates real operational pressure. She looked at her coffee, which had gone cold. "So the next move isn't just defending against the explosion investigation. It's Harrington." Elias rubbed his jaw. She heard the rasp of it. He'd been underground most of the day and hadn't shaved, and the stubble was there. "You're telling me that while we're managing an active explosion investigation, injured workers, and a potential investor withdrawal, we also need to move on a land deal. Not necessarily acquire the land, just make sure Crawford doesn't, which might mean talking to Harrington before Crawford does." She paused. "Or it might mean something else entirely. I need to think about it." "You need to sleep," he said, "after I write the letter to Foss." He didn't argue with her about it, which she had come to recognize as a form of respect. He stood up, slowly, careful of the ribs, and put on his hat. "Dunning will have the survey office documentation by morning," he said. "I'll get a sworn statement from him before the day shift starts." "Good." He moved toward the door, then stopped. Without turning around, he said, "I've been running this mine for 7 years. I've had 3 bookkeepers and 2 account managers. Not one of them would have been sitting in this office tonight thinking about Eastern Ridge land parcels." She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what response the observation required. "I'm not saying that as flattery," he said. "I'm saying it because you should know what you are to this operation. So when Crawford tells anyone who'll listen that you're here by some irregular arrangement, you know what the actual answer to that is." He left. She sat with the cold coffee and the low lamp and the letter to Gerald Foss that still needed writing, and she felt the thing he'd said settle into her the way things settle when they're true and you've been waiting without knowing it for someone to say them plainly. She pulled out a sheet of paper. She dipped her pen. "Dear Mr. Foss," she wrote, "I am writing to inform you of an incident that occurred at Blackstone Mine this past Saturday, and to provide a complete account of the facts as we currently understand them." She wrote for an hour. When she was done, the letter was 4 pages, factual and precise, with a summary of the rescue, the structural assessment, the evidence of deliberate sabotage, and the steps Blackstone was taking both to repair the damage and to pursue the investigation through the appropriate channels above local jurisdiction. She did not soften the bad news. She did not overdramatize it either. She just wrote what was true, in the order it happened, and let the facts be what they were. She read it through once, made 2 corrections, folded it. Then she sat back and looked at the wall and thought about Edwin Harrington and the Eastern Ridge parcel, and the particular problem of a man with debts who was about to be approached by someone with cash, and a long memory for how to make a situation work in his favor. There was something in it, some angle she couldn't quite see yet. She could feel it the way she felt wrong numbers before she found them. A small pressure somewhere in the back of her thinking, a signal that something wasn't adding up to what it appeared to be. She needed more information about Harrington. She needed to understand what exactly his financial situation was, and whether there was something Blackstone could offer that Crawford couldn't, and whether the offer made sense for Blackstone on its own terms, rather than just as a defensive move. She would start on it tomorrow. She put out the lamp and walked back to the boarding house in the dark, past the mine entrance where a single lantern still burned at the shaft head, past the operations building where the telegraph machine sat quiet, past the place where the mountain pushed up against the sky in a way you could feel rather than see on a moonless night. 4 men had gone into the mountain that morning. 4 men had come back out. That was the thing she held on to, walking back through the dark. Not the explosion, not Crawford, not the investor letter or the land parcel or the long list of what needed to happen next. Just that. 4 in, 4 out. It was enough to keep working from. Edwin Harrington lived 4 miles east of Black Ridge in a house that had been built with ambition and maintained with declining resources. You could see it in the way the porch boards had been replaced on one side but not the other, in the fresh paint on the front face of the house, and the weathered gray on the sides that faced away from the road. A man keeping up appearances from the direction that mattered. Vivian knew this because she had ridden out to look at the property the morning after writing to Foss, before she'd told Elias what she was doing. She hadn't gone to the door. She'd just ridden past on the main road, slowly, the way anyone might ride past on their way somewhere else. And she'd looked at the house, and the outbuildings, and the land that stretched east toward the ridge, and she'd thought about what she was looking at. The Harrington parcel was roughly 400 acres. The eastern portion of it ran along the base of the ridge that Blackstone's geological reports, she had read them all in her second week, identified as the most likely location of the primary silver deposit's continuation. If the vein running through Blackstone's northern tunnel extended eastward, at the angle the survey data suggested, a significant portion of that extension sat under Harrington land. Crawford knew this. She was certain of it, with the same certainty she had about wrong numbers before she found them. It explained why he'd been trying to buy the Harrington parcel before she arrived, and it explained why Blackstone's expanded production, which would eventually reveal the true scope of the vein, made Crawford increasingly aggressive. He wasn't just trying to protect Silverton's market position. I was trying to acquire land that contained something he'd identified, and Elias hadn't fully calculated yet. She brought all of this to Elias the next morning, along with the territorial property records she'd obtained from the Land Commission office in town, which showed the 3 mortgage adjustments on the Harrington property and the outstanding fee balance. Elias listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. How much does Harrington owe on the territorial fees? $83. It's not a large amount in absolute terms, but the fee office has flagged the property for non-payment twice, and a third flag initiates a formal review that can result in a lien. If Crawford offers to clear the fees and buys the mortgage at face value from the bank, he controls the property legally within 30 days. Has Crawford approached Harrington yet? I don't know. That's the question. Elias was quiet for a moment. Harrington is not a man I know well. We've spoken twice. He came to the Blackstone opening 3 years ago, and we had a conversation about water rights. He paused. He has a wife, Margaret. She has opinions about this town and most of the people in it. She didn't seem to have a favorable opinion of me. Vivian had heard the name Margaret Harrington once before, briefly, from Mrs. Penna, who had said something about the Harrington woman making remarks at the dry goods store about Vivian's presence at Blackstone being irregular. She had filed it and moved on. I think I should go speak with him, she said. Not you. Elias looked at her. Why not me? Because if you go, it's a land negotiation between 2 mine owners, and Harrington's pride will be involved from the first minute. He's a man in financial difficulty being approached by a larger operation. He'll assume he's being pressured. She paused. If I go, it's a different conversation. What conversation is it? An honest one. I'll tell him what I know about the vein extension and what we believe is under his land, and I'll tell him what I think Crawford intends to do, and I'll let him decide what he wants to do with that information. Elias studied her. That's a significant amount of information to give away to a man who might take it straight to Crawford. I know, but Harrington has been watching Crawford operate in this territory for years. He knows what Crawford is. She met his eyes. And I think a man who's been maintaining the front of his house because he can't afford to do the whole thing is more interested in an honest offer than he gets credit for. He thought about it. She let him think. Outside, she could hear the morning shift bell and the sounds of the operation starting up, the winch turning, voices calling down the shaft, the particular percussion of a mine waking up. Take Dunning with you, he said finally. not into the meeting, just on the road. She agreed to that. It was reasonable, and she didn't think Harrington was dangerous, just proud and possibly frightened, which was its own kind of unpredictable. She rode out the following afternoon. Dunning came along on his gray horse and stationed himself at the property gate without discussion while Vivian continued up to the house. Margaret Harrington answered the door before Vivian had finished climbing the porch steps, which meant she'd been watching from the window, which meant she'd seen someone coming up the road and had wanted to be the one who controlled the opening of the conversation. Margaret Harrington was a tall woman in her late 40s with sharp gray eyes and the particular posture of someone who had been managing a difficult situation for a long time and had decided that posture was one of the few things fully within her control. She looked at Vivian the way you look at something you've already made a judgment about and are now being asked to reconsider. "Miss Hartley," she said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Mrs. Harrington, I'd like to speak with your husband, if he's available, and with you, if you're willing. What I have to say concerns both of you." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Edwin Harrington was in the sitting room, standing near the fireplace with the look of a man who had heard the knock and positioned himself somewhere that felt authoritative. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had probably been open and easy in his youth and had grown guarded over time. He shook Vivian's hand with the careful courtesy of a man who wasn't sure yet whether he was supposed to be hostile. She sat down when offered a chair and came directly to the point, because she had learned that with people in Harrington's position, proud, financially pressured, wary, getting to the point was itself a form of respect. She told him about the vein extension. She showed him the geological survey data she'd brought, copied from Blackstone's files, and explained in plain language what the data suggested about where the silver deposit continued. She told him that Crawford had been trying to acquire his eastern parcel for 2 years, and that she believed he understood what was under the land, even if he hadn't said so directly. Then she told him about the forged surveyor, the explosion in Blackstone's northern tunnel, and what Dunning had found in the damaged drift. Edwin Harrington's face changed several times during this recitation. Margaret Harrington, who had taken a chair near the window and sat very still through all of it, changed expression exactly once when Vivian mentioned the forged territorial paperwork. And the expression that crossed her face then was not surprise. It was something colder than surprise. When Vivian finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from us?" Edwin said. "I want to propose something," she said, "not on behalf of Elias Mercer's desire to expand Blackstone, on behalf of what I think is actually in your interest." She laid it out carefully. The proposal was not an acquisition. Blackstone was not offering to buy the Harrington parcel. Instead, she proposed a mineral rights agreement. The Harringtons would retain ownership of their land and surface rights entirely, but would lease the mineral extraction rights for the eastern subsurface to a jointly managed operation. The lease payment would be structured as a percentage of production, meaning the Harringtons would receive income proportional to how much silver came out of their land, rather than a fixed payment that Crawford or anyone else could negotiate down. The outstanding territorial fees would be cleared immediately as part of the agreement. The mortgage situation would be addressed through a structured arrangement with the bank that Fitch could facilitate. She stopped there and let it sit. Edwin looked at the geological survey pages on the table between them. Margaret was looking at Vivian. "You're not asking us to sell," Margaret said. It wasn't quite a question. "No, you keep the land. You keep the surface. You receive income from what's under it. And Blackstone controls the extraction. Jointly managed. The agreement would specify reporting requirements. The Harringtons would receive monthly production accounts and have the right to request an independent review at any time." She paused deliberately. "Full access to the books. My books specifically, since you presumably know something about how I keep them." Something shifted in Margaret Harrington's face. It was small, but it was there. "Crawford offered us $60,000 for the parcel," Edwin said. "Cash." Vivian had expected a number. She hadn't been certain of the size of it. 60,000 was substantial, large enough to clear the debt, large enough to change their circumstances significantly. She kept her face level. "That offer would disappear the moment Crawford had the deed," she said, "because once he controls the land, he controls what he tells you about what comes out of it. He would extract the silver and the Harringtons would never know how much there was." She let that land for a moment. "Under a mineral rights agreement with reporting requirements, You know exactly what your land produces. Crawford's 60,000 is a number on a piece of paper. The production percentage is a number that keeps coming for as long as the vein holds. Edwin looked at his wife. Margaret looked at the geological survey pages. Then she looked at Vivian with those sharp gray eyes. How long does the vein hold? She asked. I'm not a geologist, but based on the production data from Blackstone's current operations and the survey projections for the eastern continuation, a conservative estimate would be 12 to 15 years of productive extraction. She paused. At current silver prices and projected production volume, a reasonable royalty percentage on that timeline would exceed Crawford's 60,000 within 3 years. The room was quiet again. Edwin's jaw worked slightly. Margaret's hands, folded in her lap, pressed together once and then relaxed. We'd need Fitch to review any agreement, Edwin said finally. Of course. I would expect nothing less. And we'd want independent legal counsel, not Blackstone's lawyer. Absolutely appropriate. He looked at his wife again. Something passed between them in the way of long married people. Not a conversation, just a current. We're not signing anything today, Margaret said. I'm not asking you to, Vivian said. I'm asking you to consider it before Crawford's offer has an expiration date attached to it, because it will. She rode back to Black Ridge with Dunning mostly in silence. He asked once how it had gone. She said she didn't know yet. He accepted that and didn't ask again. She gave Elias a full account that evening. He listened and then said, Margaret Harrington called you irregular at the dry goods store. People change their assessments when they have better information. Or they don't. Or they don't, she agreed. But I think Margaret Harrington is a woman who has been managing a difficult situation for a long time and is very tired of not knowing what's actually under her land. I think she's been suspicious of Crawford's offer for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, and I think today I gave her language for what she already suspected. Elias was quiet for a moment. Crawford is going to find out you went to Harrington. Probably by tomorrow. He'll accelerate his offer, try to close it before the Harringtons have time to consider ours. That's why I told them an expiration date was coming. They'll be expecting pressure. Pressure they're expecting is less effective than pressure that surprises them. He rubbed his jaw. The ribs were still bothering him. She could see it in how he held himself, the slightly stiffened posture that he'd been carrying for the past week. He hadn't complained about them once, which she had come to understand was not stoicism, so much as a deep practical disinterest in discussing things he couldn't change. The Territorial Marshal's office responded to Fitch this morning, he said. They're sending an investigator. He'll arrive in about 10 days. That's good. It's good if the investigator is actually independent. It's neutral if he's another Harker. He paused. Fitch says the man they're sending is named Cole. He has a reputation for being difficult. Difficult how? Difficult for everyone. Not particular about which side of a case he makes uncomfortable. Elias almost smiled. Fitch considers that a positive sign. She considered it a positive sign too. An investigator who made everyone uncomfortable was an investigator who was actually investigating rather than providing the appearance of investigation while arriving at a predetermined destination. The next several days were a particular kind of busy that she had not experienced before. Not the methodical busy of rebuilding accounts, but a lateral, multi-directional busy that required her to hold several unresolved situations simultaneously and not let the pressure of any one of them collapse her attention on the others. The Harrington negotiation was in a waiting period that she couldn't push. The Marshal's investigator was 10 days out. The Northern Drift repair was underway, which created operational complications that rippled through the production schedule and therefore the production accounts. Chen was recovering. He was sitting up and taking meals, which Briggs considered ahead of schedule, but he was out of engineering work for at least another 2 weeks, which created its own coverage problem. And then Crawford made his move, and it was not the move she had expected. She had expected him to go back to Harrington with an enhanced offer and a compressed timeline. Instead, he went to the Territorial Land Commission directly and filed a formal complaint alleging that Blackstone Mine was operating in violation of its extraction license, specifically that the explosion in the Northern Drift had caused subsurface disturbance that extended beyond Blackstone's licensed boundaries and into adjacent parcels. It was clever. She gave him that, sitting in Fitch's office on the day Fitch showed her the filing. It was genuinely clever because it used the explosion, which Crawford had caused, as the instrument of regulatory pressure against the mine Crawford had sabotaged. It created a situation where Blackstone had to respond to a legal complaint at the same time it was managing the physical repairs and the incoming marshal's investigation. And it put the Harrington parcel directly into the complaint, because the Harrington property was the adjacent parcel in question. Crawford was essentially claiming that Blackstone's explosion had damaged Harrington land, which was a way of saying Blackstone owed Harrington something, which was a way of positioning himself as Harrington's ally and Blackstone's opponent in the land dispute. It was the kind of move that looked, from the outside, like a man defending a neighbor's interests. It was actually a man trying to use the legal process to freeze Blackstone's operation while he closed the Harrington deal before anyone could stop him. Fitch spread the complaint on his desk and looked at it with the expression of a man who genuinely appreciated a well-constructed problem, even when the problem was aimed at his client. "He's good," Fitch said. "He's had practice," Vivian said. "What does this filing actually require us to do?" "Respond within 20 days with a survey demonstrating that the subsurface disturbance from the explosion did not cross the licensed boundary, or petition for an extension, or challenge the standing of the complaint." "Can we challenge the standing?" Crawford's basis for standing is that he represents the interests of affected landowners in the region. It's thin, but it's not frivolous. Fitch took off his glasses and cleaned them, which he did when he was thinking hard. "The most effective response is the survey. If you can demonstrate the disturbance stayed within Blackstone's licensed boundary, the complaint collapses on its own factual basis. How long does a survey take?" "Properly done, 2 weeks minimum. We have 20 days. He put his glasses back on. "But here's the problem. The Territorial Commission will likely send their own surveyor to verify whatever we produce. And the last surveyor who came to the Black Ridge area on commission business was Crawford's man with forged paperwork." She thought about this for a moment. "Can we request that the commission's surveyor be named in advance and that we be given the opportunity to verify their credentials before they're admitted to the mine?" Fitch looked at her. "That's unusual but not prohibited. Make the request, formally, in the response to the complaint, and name Harker as a party who should be recused from any involvement in overseeing the process, with the reason being his documented relationship with Crawford." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Naming Harker is aggressive. Crawford filing a complaint based on an explosion he caused is also aggressive. I'd rather be aggressive honestly than polite about a problem that's going to keep getting worse." She paused. "We also need to tell the Harringtons about this complaint before they hear it from Crawford. They need to understand that Crawford is using their land as a procedural tool without their knowledge or consent." Fitch agreed to that. She drafted the formal response herself, working with Fitch on the legal language, and they filed it 3 days after receiving the complaint, well within the window, and specific enough to signal that Blackstone understood exactly what Crawford was attempting. She wrote out to the Harrington property. The same afternoon, the filing went in. Edwin wasn't home. Margaret answered the door. Vivian told her about the complaint, all of it, including the analysis of what Crawford was actually attempting and why the Harrington parcel was named in it. She watched Margaret's face move through several things in quick succession: anger, understanding, and then something that looked like a decision being made. "He told Edwin last week that he was trying to protect our property from Blackstone's negligence," Margaret said. Her voice was flat. "He used the word negligence." "I know. And he offered to increase his purchase offer by $5,000 to help us manage any disruption caused by what Blackstone had done to the land." 70,000 then. Crawford was escalating. Vivian kept her face neutral. "What did Edwin say?" Margaret looked at her directly. "Edwin is still thinking about it. He is a man who has been under financial pressure for long enough that a large number has a gravitational pull regardless of where it comes from." She paused. "I am not still thinking about it." Vivian waited. "I've been watching Silas Crawford operate in this territory since we arrived here 11 years ago," Margaret said. "He helped our neighbor Ferris acquire a water rights license that turned out to be invalid. Ferris lost 3 years of irrigation and nearly his property before he sorted it out. Crawford expressed deep concern throughout." Her voice was steady but very quiet. "He is a man who helps you into a room and then locks the door." "Yes," Vivian said. "Your offer, the mineral rights arrangement, I want to understand it fully. I want Fitch to look at it, as Edwin said, and I want our own attorney to look at it. I want the production reporting requirements in writing, and I want them specific enough that they can't be reinterpreted. She met Vivian's eyes. "And I want to know one thing directly from you, not from a document. Ask it. If Blackstone's investigation into the explosion produces evidence that Crawford was behind it, which I suspect it will, what happens to that evidence?" "It goes to the Territorial Marshal's office," Vivian said. "We're not going to use it as leverage in the land negotiation or in any other private arrangement. It goes to the authorities, and then it goes where the law takes it." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Crawford would use it as leverage." "I know. I'm not Crawford." The walk back to the gate was quiet. Dunning was waiting at the road. He looked at her when she mounted. "Well?" he said. "I think we're going to get the mineral rights agreement," she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She took it for an expression of measured optimism, which was as much as Dunning expressed about anything. She had not told Elias about the Harrington situation's development before going, partly because she'd been moving quickly to get ahead of Crawford's timeline, and partly because she'd learned something in the past 3 weeks about when to bring Elias into a decision and when to simply move and report back. This was the second kind. He would have wanted to think about it, which was a good instinct in most situations, but this was a situation where Crawford's urgency was real and hesitation was its own kind of action. She told him that evening. He listened to all of it, including the Margaret Harrington conversation, without speaking. When she finished, he said, "You went back to the Harrington property twice without telling me." "I told you the first time before I went." "You told me after you'd already ridden past the property and assessed the situation." She looked at him. "Are you angry about that?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, which she believed. "I'm trying to understand the principle you're operating on." "The principle is that you hired me to manage Blackstone's financial and strategic position," she said. "When a situation requires moving faster than the time it takes to have a full discussion, I move. I report back and you tell me if I've done something wrong. So far you haven't." He held her gaze. "And if I had? Then I'd listen, and I'd argue if I thought you were wrong and comply if the argument didn't change your mind." She paused. "That's how I work. I should have explained it earlier." He was quiet again. Outside, the evening was coming down and the mine was settling into its night sounds. The slower rhythms of a reduced crew, the distant sound of the winch being secured. "The consortium idea," he said. "You mentioned something to Foss about having a view you hadn't fully worked out yet. The Crawford situation." "Yes." "Have you worked it out?" She had been thinking about it since the Foss meeting, building it in the background while the foreground was full of explosions and Harrington land and territorial complaints. It had been assembling itself slowly, the way the reconstructed accounts had assembled, one piece at a time, each piece demanding another. "I think defeating Crawford isn't the goal," she said. "I think the goal is making Crawford's continued opposition more expensive than his cooperation." Elias looked at her. "You want to bring Crawford into an arrangement. I want to propose something that makes him more money as a partner than he makes as an enemy. Not because I think he deserves it, because I think it removes the ongoing threat at a cost that's lower than fighting him indefinitely. He sabotaged our mine. I know, and the Marshal's investigation will deal with that through legal channels. That's separate from the business strategy." She met his eyes. "The legal process is the legal process. The business is the business. Mixing them together means Crawford can use one to hold the other hostage, which is exactly what he's been doing to us." Elias leaned back. He pressed his hands flat on the desk, and she could see him working through something. Not the idea itself, but some internal resistance to the idea that was real and needed to be acknowledged before he could move past it. "You want me to sit at a table with the man who put Daniel Chen in a mining tunnel with a bomb in it," he said. She didn't soften it. "Yes." The room was quiet for a long time. "What does the arrangement look like?" he said finally. She had been waiting for that question because that question meant the resistance had been acknowledged and set to one side and he was ready to think. She laid it out. The three-way consortium structure that would bring Blackstone, Crawford Silverton, and the Harrington mineral rights together under a joint operating agreement with shared infrastructure and strict legal governance. Shared tunnel development in the Eastern Ridge, shared processing equipment, shared transportation costs to the railroad connection at Fort Cassidy. Individual mines maintained separate operational identities and separate profit streams, but the shared infrastructure made everyone more efficient. The legal agreement would be specific enough that sabotage, fraudulent reporting, or regulatory manipulation by any party constituted an immediate breach with significant financial penalties. Crawford would have no mechanism to damage Blackstone through the consortium that didn't damage himself equally. The Hamilton Group, she said, would back the expansion specifically because a three-party consortium with legal governance is a more stable investment than a single mine operation in a territory with a history of claim disputes. Foss asked about regional stability. This is regional stability. Elias looked at the desk. He turned his hands over once, the way he did when he was at the end of his thinking and arriving at something. Crawford will never accept an agreement that limits his ability to maneuver, he said. Crawford will accept an agreement that makes him substantially richer than he currently is if the alternative is a marshal's investigation, a failed regulatory complaint, a lost land deal, and an increasingly productive Blackstone operation eating into his market. She paused. He doesn't need to want the agreement. He needs to want it more than he wants the fight. And if he doesn't? Then we've lost nothing by proposing it. We're already fighting. She kept her voice level. But I think he will. Because the one thing I've learned about Silas Crawford in 4 months of watching him operate is that he is ultimately a practical man. The cruelty and the manipulation, those are tools. Underneath them is a man who wants to be wealthy and powerful in this territory, and the consortium makes him both. Elias was quiet for a long time. Then, who presents it to him? She had thought about this carefully. Not you, not me directly. Fitch should present the initial framework as a legal proposition, neutral, procedural, without personality attached to it. Crawford needs to think he's being offered a business arrangement, not surrendering to Blackstone. And you think he'll believe that? I think he'll choose to believe it because it's easier than the alternative. She paused. Crawford is smart enough to know he's losing ground. He just needs a way to frame the retreat that feels like his own decision. Elias studied her across the desk. The lamp between them was burning steadily, and she was aware of how many evenings they'd spent in exactly this configuration. The two of them at the end of a long day, working through something that required both of them to get it right. She had not expected, when she'd walked into this office for the first time 4 months ago, with 41 pages of documentation and a 1.5% stake, and the particular determination of a woman who had run out of other options, to find that she would become someone Elias Mercer thought alongside rather than someone he directed. It had happened gradually, without announcement, in the space between the questions he asked and the answers she gave. "All right," he said, "talk to Fitch." She nodded and stood. She was reaching for her coat when he said, "Vivian." She stopped. He had never used her first name before, not once in 4 months. "The man who rejected you," he said. "Crawford." "I know who he is." "He's going to be at a table with you. Whatever we arrange, he's going to be sitting across from you at some point." He paused. "I want to make sure you're all right with that." She thought about the parlor in Black Ridge. The 10 minutes. The flat certainty of a man who had never questioned himself. "I'm all right with it," she said. "He rejected me because he thought my independence was a liability." She picked up her coat. "I'd like him to see what it built." She went back to her desk and started drafting the consortium framework. The lamp held steady. The mountains sat outside in the dark, full of silver and patience, and Vivian wrote through the evening in the same way she had been writing through evenings since she arrived. Without hurry, without waste, with the precise and particular attention of a woman who understood that the difference between a good document and an airtight one was exactly the kind of care that most people stopped just short of giving. The framework took 3 evenings to draft. She gave it to Fitch on a Thursday. He read it twice, made 6 comments, and said it was the most sophisticated piece of mining consortium law he had seen produced by someone who was not a lawyer. "I'm not trying to be a lawyer," she said. "I'm trying to make something Crawford can't wriggle out of." "Those are the same goal," Fitch said, "and you've achieved both." The marshal's investigator arrived 2 days later. Cole was a lean, weathered man in his early 50s who shook nobody's hand too enthusiastically and asked his first question before he'd taken off his hat. He was, as Fitch had said, difficult. He was difficult with Elias and difficult with Dunning and difficult with the miners he interviewed about the morning of the explosion. He was even difficult with Vivian, which she appreciated more than the alternative would have been. He spent 4 days at the mine and 2 days in town, and 1 day, she knew from Fitch, at Silas Crawford's operation. She did not know what happened at that last visit. She knew only that Crawford was very quiet for the 3 days following it, which was not Crawford's usual manner. The consortium framework went to Crawford through Fitch on the same week the Marshal's investigation was concluding. The timing was not accidental. A man facing an active criminal investigation into sabotage and fraud receives a business proposal with a different calculus than a man who feels untouchable. She did not know, sitting in the accounting office on the evening Fitch delivered the framework to Crawford's attorney, whether it would work. She did not have certainty. She'd learned to stop expecting certainty, because certainty in situations like this was something you told yourself to manage fear, and she had found that managing fear was less useful than just working with it present. What she had instead was the same thing she'd had sitting on the edge of the bed in the boarding house on her first night in Blackridge, counting bills that wouldn't change no matter how many times she counted them. A clear understanding of the situation, a plan that was as good as she could make it, and the knowledge that she had done the honest work. She had her lamp, she had her pen. She had the accounts in front of her, and the accounts were clean, and she went back to them the way she always went back to them. With the particular steadiness of a woman who had decided, a long time ago in a small kitchen in Boston, that she was going to do the work regardless of what the room around her thought about it. Crawford's attorney sent a response 9 days later. It was not a yes. It was a list of proposed modifications to the consortium framework, 23 of them, some substantive, some designed to test how flexible the agreement actually was. She read all 23. She accepted 6 immediately. She rejected 11 outright with written reasoning. She proposed counter-language on the remaining 6 that addressed Crawford's stated concerns while preserving the enforcement mechanisms she was not willing to compromise. It was, in the way of negotiations, a beginning, but it was Crawford's attorney responding on the substance rather than dismissing the proposal, which meant Crawford had looked at the framework and done the same calculation she'd predicted he would do. More money as a partner, or a losing fight against a mind that had just proven, in front of a territorial commissioner and a room full of witnesses, that its books were cleaner than his reputation. She put the response on Elias's desk with her own markup alongside it. He came in, read both documents, and looked at her. "He's negotiating," he said. "He's negotiating," she confirmed. And for the first time in 4 months of working in a small office at the base of a mountain, while powerful men tried various methods of making her disappear, Vivian Hartley allowed herself something very close to satisfaction, which she kept off her face, and went back to work. The negotiations took 6 weeks. Not 6 weeks of continuous argument, 6 weeks of the particular rhythm that serious negotiations fall into when both sides are actually engaging rather than performing engagement. A document would go to Crawford's attorney. His attorney would respond. Vivian would mark up the response. Fitch would review her markup. They would send back a revised draft. Crawford's attorney would sit on it for 3 or 4 days, which she understood to be the time required for Crawford himself to read it, object to things, be talked down from the objections, and allow his attorney to respond professionally. She had expected the process to feel like a siege. It felt more like accounting. Slow, detail-oriented, requiring attention to things that seemed small until they turned out to be load-bearing. The enforcement mechanisms were the hardest fought. Crawford's attorney kept trying to soften the language around what constituted a breach and what the financial consequences of a breach would be. Vivian kept hardening it back. The final agreed language was not as strong as what she'd originally drafted, but it was specific enough to have teeth, and teeth were what mattered. The Harrington Agreement concluded first, which helped. Edwin and Margaret signed the mineral rights lease in Fitch's office on a Wednesday morning in late August, 3 months after Vivian had ridden past the Harrington property on the main road and looked at the uneven paint job and started thinking. Edwin shook Vivian's hand with the slightly complicated manner of a man who was relieved and proud, and not entirely comfortable with how much of the relief had come from someone else's effort. Margaret shook her hand without complication at all. "You said Crawford would put an expiration date on his offer," Margaret said as they were leaving Fitch's office. "He did, 2 weeks ago. Told Edwin he needed an answer by the end of the month." "I know," Vivian said. "Fitch told me." "We didn't tell you." "No, but the timing made sense and Crawford's patterns are fairly consistent by now." She paused at the top of the office stairs. "I'm glad you went with the arrangement that made sense for your family, rather than the number that felt large in the moment." Margaret looked at her with those sharp gray eyes. Then she said something Vivian didn't expect. I told people at the dry goods store that your presence at Blackstone was irregular when you first arrived. I know. I was wrong to say it. She said it flatly, without excess apology, the way someone makes a correction rather than a confession. I was wrong about what irregular meant. Vivian nodded once, and they went their separate ways down the street. She filed the moment away, not because she needed the validation, but because it was true. And true things deserved to be filed accurately. The consortium agreement was finalized on a Thursday in September. Crawford signed it in Fitch's office without ceremony, which was exactly right. Ceremony would have required everyone to perform feelings they didn't have. Crawford's signature was controlled, precise, the signature of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it without flagging his interior state. He did not look at Vivian across the table. She did not require him to. What she required was the signature, and she had it. The Hamilton Group's formal commitment came 4 days later, a letter from Foss to Elias that confirmed the investment at the figure they'd discussed, contingent on the consortium agreement being filed with the Territorial Land Commission, which it now was. Foss had added a handwritten line at the bottom of the formal letter. The financial documentation produced by your account manager was the most thorough pre-investment package this group has received from a territorial operation. Please convey our appreciation. Elias showed her the letter. She read it, including the handwritten line. She set it back on his desk. He spelled account manager correctly, she said. Elias looked at her. That's your response? I don't know what other response is appropriate to a compliment from someone who's already signed the check. He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it in 5 months, and it lasted only a second, but it was real. The marshal's investigation concluded in October. Cole's report was thorough and, as Fitch had predicted, difficult for everyone. It confirmed that the explosion in Blackstone's northern tunnel had been deliberately set by a person or persons who had entered the mine under false territorial surveying credentials. It confirmed that the credentials were forged. It found significant circumstantial evidence connecting the forged credentials to an individual in Crawford's employ, a man named Pressler who had disappeared from the Black Ridge area shortly after the explosion and had not been located despite the investigation. It found no direct documentary evidence connecting Crawford himself to the order to set the charge. Crawford was not charged. Pressler, wherever he was, remained wanted. The report made its way into the territorial record and sat there with the particular weight of a document that said everything and proved just enough. She had known this was a possible outcome, probably the likely outcome, if she was honest with herself. Men like Crawford were careful about direct connections, which was how they remained men like Crawford across long periods of time. The legal system had found the edge of what it could reach and stopped there. She was not satisfied with this. She did not pretend to be satisfied with it. But she had told Margaret Harrington that the evidence would go to the authorities and follow the law wherever the law could take it, and she had meant it, and she stood by it even when the law's reach fell short of where she would have preferred it to land. What the investigation did accomplish, beyond the formal record, was something more diffuse and harder to measure. Crawford knew that Cole had been in his operation for 2 days asking questions. Crawford knew that the territorial record now contained a finding of deliberate sabotage with circumstantial connections to his employ. Crawford knew that Vivian Hartley had built the case that brought the marshal here, and that she had done it with the same methodical, airtight precision she'd brought to everything else. Some things that can't be proven can still be understood. Crawford understood. Daniel Chen came back to work in the 3rd week of October, 6 weeks after the explosion. He arrived at the operations building on a Monday morning with his head still carrying a faint scar above his left ear that the hair hadn't fully grown back over yet, and he went directly to the engineering desk and began reviewing the Northern Drift reconstruction plans without being asked. Dunning found him there an hour later and stood in the doorway for a moment, and then said, without looking at him directly, "Good to have you back." Chen said, "The tunnel reinforced on the east wall of the reconstruction is using the wrong timber grade. Someone needs to fix that before the next crew goes in." Dunning looked at the plans. Then he went and fixed it. Vivian saw Chen at supper that evening and asked how he was. He said his head ached in the afternoons and he was slower than he wanted to be, but the engineering work was clear, and that helped. She told him about the consortium and the Harrington Mineral Rights Agreement and the Eastern Ridge Development Plan. He listened with the focused attention he brought to everything and then said, "The Eastern Drift is going to need a different approach than the Northern Tunnel. The geology shifts about 100 feet in from the Harrington boundary. I know, she said. I was going to ask you to put together a technical brief on that for the consortium planning meeting. He looked at her. When's the meeting? 2 weeks. You'd be presenting the engineering section. He was quiet for a moment, then, the men on my crew, the supplemental wage payments. They know it was you who found it. They shouldn't. That was supposed to be confidential, yes. It wasn't. He said it without apology, the way he said most things. Word moves differently in a crew than you might expect. He paused. They wanted me to tell you. She didn't know what to do with that any more than she'd known what to do with it the first time a similar moment had appeared. She said, Tell them the accounts are correct now. That's what matters. Chen nodded and went back to his supper, and she went back to hers, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was. The first consortium planning meeting took place in the Blackstone Operations Building on a Friday in late October, around a table that was not quite big enough for everyone who needed to be at it, which meant people were closer together than was entirely comfortable. Crawford arrived with his mine foreman and his attorney. Edwin Harrington came with Margaret. Elias had Vivian and Dunning and Fitch and Chen. Foss had sent a representative from the Hamilton Group, not himself, a younger man named Brierley, who asked good questions and wrote everything down. Vivian ran the financial portion of the meeting. She had prepared materials for each participant, production projections, cost-sharing models, reporting structures, a timeline for the Eastern Ridge development. She presented them the way she presented everything, in plain language, with the logic visible, with the numbers traceable to their sources. Crawford sat across the table and looked at the materials with the expression of a man who is reading something carefully precisely because he is trying to find something wrong with it. She watched him page through the cost-sharing model twice. He asked 2 questions, both specific and both reasonable. She answered them directly. He made a note and didn't ask anything else. At one point during the break, Crawford stood near the window with his coffee, and she happened to be standing near the same window because it was the only place in the room that wasn't crowded. They were not quite side by side, more at an angle to each other, both looking out at the mine operations visible through the glass. He said, without looking at her, "The Eastern projection figures. They're conservative." "Yes?" she said. "Why?" "Because investor projections that turn out to be conservative produce confidence. Investor projections that turn out to be optimistic produce lawsuits." He was quiet for a moment. "The actual projection is higher." "Probably. I'd rather the number surprise upward than downward." He looked out the window for another moment. Then he said, "You're good at this." She didn't thank him. She didn't perform graciousness about it. She just said, "I know," and moved back toward the table when the break ended. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was 2 people who had been in opposition acknowledging, briefly and without excess, that the opposition had produced something that worked. She did not need more from Crawford than that. She had not come to Colorado Territory looking for his approval, and she was not going to start needing it now. The meeting concluded with a signed operational outline and a timeline. Brierley from the Hamilton Group shook everyone's hand and said the investment funds would be released in tranches tied to the development milestones, which was standard and expected. Crawford's attorney filed the consortium registration with the Territorial Land Commission the following Monday. It was done. The Northern Tunnel reconstruction finished in November. The crew that completed it was mixed. Blackstone men and a team Crawford had sent as part of the consortium's shared labor agreement, which was the first tangible cooperation between the 2 operations. Dunning supervised and reported to Vivian that it had gone without incident, by which she understood him to mean there had been arguments and difficulties and the usual friction of people who don't know each other working in close quarters underground, but nothing that constituted an actual problem. Chen's Eastern Drift report confirmed what the geological data had suggested. The Silver Vein's eastern extension was substantial. The first test drilling on the Harrington parcel boundary produced ore samples that Dunning described, in his way, as significant. He brought a sample to her office and set it on the desk without preamble. She looked at it, a rough chunk of rock with the dull silver-gray threads running through it. Not beautiful, the way people who'd never worked near a mine expected it to be. Just dense and gray and heavy with what it contained. "How significant?" she asked. "Enough to make the next 5 years interesting," he said, and took the sample back. She wrote a production estimate revision into the quarterly report. adjusting the eastern projection upward from the conservative figure she'd presented at the consortium meeting, and noted in the methodology section that the revision was supported by initial drilling data. Brierley from the Hamilton Group received the report and sent back a short letter saying the group was pleased with the progress. Margaret Harrington received the same report under the Mineral Rights Agreement's transparency provisions. She sent back no letter, but the following week she appeared at the Blackstone accounting office for the first time, in the late afternoon, and asked to see the production accounts. Vivian showed her everything. They spent 2 hours going through the numbers, and Margaret asked questions that were more perceptive than most of the questions Vivian had fielded from people who called themselves financial professionals. The Harrington land had apparently produced a woman who understood figures and had simply never been in a room where anyone thought to ask her about them. When they were done, Margaret stood and put on her coat. She paused near the door. "I told Edwin last night that I think we made the right decision," she said, "about the mineral rights. I'm glad. I also told him that I want to be more involved in the financial reporting, not just receiving the documents, understanding them." Vivian looked at her. "I can arrange that. If you want to come through the accounts with me once a month, I can walk you through what you're looking at and why." Margaret's expression was not quite warm, but it was something. It was the expression of a woman who had spent a long time being the capable person in the room who wasn't consulted, recognizing the same quality in someone else. "Once a month," she said, and left. December came down cold off the mountains, and the mine adjusted to the rhythms of winter operations. Reduced crews in the deep cold, careful management of ventilation in the upper tunnels where ice could form in ways that created hazards. Vivian spent more time in her office than usual and less time outside, which suited her well enough. The quarterly accounts were satisfying in the particular way that accounts are satisfying when they reflect something real, not manipulated figures, not optimistic projections, just the actual product of actual work clearly stated. She wrote to her sister in Boston. A long letter, the longest she'd managed since arriving in Colorado. She told her about the mine and the consortium and the Harrington Agreement and Chen's recovery and the winter operations. She told her about Elias without quite knowing how to describe him. She wrote the man who owns the mine and hired me and then crossed it out, and wrote my employer and then crossed that out too, and finally wrote a man I work with closely who is nothing like what I expected to find here, and left it. Her sister wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was warm and slightly worried and full of questions about whether Vivian was eating enough and whether Black Ridge had a proper doctor. Vivian read it twice and set it on her desk and felt, for the first time since arriving in Colorado, something she recognized as homesickness. Not for Boston specifically, but for the particular ease of being known, of not having to establish yourself from zero in every conversation. Then she picked up the quarterly report she was in the middle of and went back to work, because feeling homesick was real and allowed and did not, in any practical sense, change the accounts. It was on an evening in late December, one of those evenings that Colorado produces in winter where the cold settles in hard and clear and the sky goes a deep pure blue at the last of the light, that Elias found her on the porch of the operations building. She had stepped outside for air. The office had been close and warm all day, and she needed a few minutes of cold. And she was standing looking at the mountain above them and the last of the blue light on the snow up there, and she heard him come out and stand beside her. They stood like that for a moment, neither of them speaking. It was not uncomfortable. They had spent 5 months in enough close quarters that silence had stopped being something that required filling. "Chen filed his Eastern Drift engineering brief today," he said. "I saw it. The revised timeline adds 3 weeks to the first phase, which I've already built into the consortium report. He's good. He's excellent. We should formalize his role, chief engineer rather than senior engineer. The consortium structure creates enough complexity that we need the title to match the responsibility." "Done." He paused. "I've been thinking about something." She waited. "When you arrived here," he said, "I offered you a position because you were useful. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't generosity. I had a specific problem and you could solve it." "I know," she said. "You said so at the time. I appreciated it." "What I didn't tell you," he said, "was that Crawford had come to me 2 days before I spoke to you. He'd heard you were in town, and he told me, as a friendly warning," he said, "that a woman with your kind of opinions would cause trouble for any man who gave her real authority." He stopped. "He told me not to hire you." She looked at him. The last of the blue light was fading off the snow above them. I hired you because Crawford told me not to, Elias said, which is not the same thing as hiring you for the right reasons. She thought about this for a moment. What would the right reasons have been? That you were the most qualified person who'd walked into Black Ridge in 2 years. He said it plainly. I knew it was true when I said hello to you on the street. I just let being contrary to Crawford do work that should have been straightforward. It got you to the same place. Not the right way? She looked back at the mountain. A man telling her he'd arrived at a right decision through complicated reasoning was not unusual. Men arrived at right decisions through complicated reasoning all the time. The important thing was usually the decision, not the reasoning behind it. But she understood why he was telling her. He was making a correction, the way Margaret had made a correction outside Fitch's office. Precise people felt the need to correct imprecise records. You treated me honestly once I was here, she said. You gave me full access. You acted on what I found. You renegotiated the terms when the work exceeded the title. I can't ask for more than that. I'm asking for more than that, he said. From myself. She looked at him. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it's not, he said. And this was different from his usual manner. The usual manner was direct, unhedged, already arrived at. This was the voice of a man working out what he meant while he was saying it. I've been running this mine alone for 7 years. Every decision was mine. Every failure was mine too, but every decision. And I thought that was just how it was. The cost of it. She waited. Since August, he said, I haven't made a single significant decision without thinking about how you'd analyze it. Not because I need your permission, because the analysis is better when both of us have been through it. He stopped. That's not a small thing to me. I didn't expect it. The mountain was dark now at the base, and the upper snow had gone from blue to gray. A lamp came on in the boarding house window below them. What are you asking me? She said quietly. I'm not asking you anything, he said. I'm telling you something, and then I'm going to ask you something, and those are different. All right. What I'm telling you is that I see you clearly, not the version of you that's useful to the mine, you. The woman who counted bills in a boarding house and decided to trust a stranger with a leather coat because the alternative was going home defeated. The woman who spent 14-hour days rebuilding accounts for people who couldn't do it themselves, including workers she'd never met, because it was simply the right thing. The woman who walked into a room with Crawford and his territorial commissioners and put the books on the table because she'd done the work, and the work could stand up. He paused. I see all of that, and I respect all of it. And I want to say that plainly before I ask you anything, so you know the question comes from the right place. She was looking at him. Her chest was doing something she was trying to keep off her face and not entirely succeeding. What I'm asking, he said, is whether you'd be willing to make this permanent. Not just the position, not just the stake in the mine, all of it. He stopped for a moment, then said it directly. I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not so that Blackstone has a manager, not so I have someone to run the accounts. Because I don't want to build this thing without you, and I don't want to keep pretending that's a professional preference. She was quiet for a long time. Not because she didn't know the answer. She'd known, if she was honest, for weeks, in the way you know things that you're not quite ready to name. But because this moment deserved to be sat in rather than rushed through, and because she wanted to be precise about what she was agreeing to before she agreed. I need to ask you something first, she said. All right. If I disagree with a business decision after we're married, what changes? He looked at her. Nothing. If I'm right and you're wrong and the accounts show it, then you tell me and I listen and we figure it out. He said it with the flat simplicity of a man who had already thought this through. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are. I'm asking you to be who you are while also being my wife. Those aren't in conflict. She looked at the dark mountain. She thought about her mother in the kitchen in Boston, managing everything alone because the alternative was not managing. She thought about the accounting firm that had let her go politely. She thought about the 10 minutes in Crawford's parlor and the particular expression on his face when he said too independent. She thought about Elias Mercer saying, I want a partner who can challenge me before he even knew he was going to say it. Saying it through every decision he'd made since August, through every room he'd walked her into and every authority he'd handed over and every silence he'd given her to work in. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes? Yes? She met his eyes. But I want it in writing. He stared at her for a second. Then he did actually laugh. A short, genuine sound, surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who has been serious for a very long time and finds something genuinely funny. "You want a marriage contract," he said. "I want the partnership terms clear, professionally and personally." She kept her face straight, though it cost her something. "I've seen what happens to agreements that aren't documented. Fitch is going to think we've both lost our minds." "Fitch will think it's the most sensible thing he's been asked to draw up all year." She paused. "And he'd be right." Elias looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at things that were both unexpected and exactly correct at the same time. Then he offered his hand, not in the performed way, not as a gesture, just his hand, the way he did everything. She took it. They stood on the porch for another minute in the cold, looking at the mountain and the lit window below and the dark spread of Colorado territory around them, and neither of them said anything else, because everything that needed saying had been said, and what was left was just what came next. What came next was long and difficult and rewarding in ways that didn't always look like reward. The Eastern Ridge development took 2 years and required 3 separate engineering revisions as the geology surprised them in the ways geology always surprises people who think they've understood it. The consortium had its rough patches. Crawford tested the agreement's enforcement mechanisms twice in the first year, once by submitting production reports with figures that didn't reconcile, and once by attempting to reclassify a shared labor arrangement in a way that shifted costs to Blackstone. Both times, Vivian caught it in the quarterly reconciliation. Both times, the consortium's dispute resolution process, which she had drafted and Crawford's attorney had spent weeks trying to weaken, resolved the issue without escalating. Crawford stopped testing after the second time, not because he became a different man, because the cost of testing had become clear and he was practical. Rusk was found in the spring of the following year in Leadville, working at a smaller mining operation under a different name. Fitch coordinated with the Leadville authorities and the Territorial Prosecutor's Office. The case went to trial in Denver in the summer. Vivian testified, bringing the reconstructed accounts with her, and she spent 3 days on the stand explaining financial documentation to a jury in language plain enough that every one of them could follow it. Rusk was convicted on 7 counts of fraud and 1 count of wage theft, the wage theft count being the one Fitch said was unusual to prosecute, and that they prosecuted anyway. The conviction didn't give her back the hours she'd spent in that small office, or the night she'd worked while other people slept, or the particular quality of tension that had lived in her chest for most of the first year in Black Ridge. But it closed a door that had been standing open, and closed doors meant something to her. Daniel Chen was promoted to chief engineer in January of the new year, which Vivian had been recommending since October. He put together an engineering team that was, by the end of the consortium's second year, considered the most technically sophisticated mining operation in the territory. 2 engineers from other operations applied to work under him specifically. He accepted one, turned down one, and wrote up his reasons for both decisions in a clear technical brief that she kept because it was the kind of document that showed you exactly who a person was. Margaret Harrington came to the accounting office once a month, as she'd said she would, and she learned. She was not a quick study in the way Vivian was a quick study. She was a slower, more thorough one, the kind that builds understanding that doesn't erode. By the end of the first year, she was reviewing the Harrington mineral rights production statements herself without guidance. By the end of the second, she was the one explaining them to Edwin. The year after the consortium was established, a woman in Durango who had heard about Vivian wrote to her asking for advice on restructuring a failing freighting operation. Vivian wrote back a long letter. The woman wrote back again. The correspondence became a consultation. The freighting operation stopped failing. There were 3 more consultations after that, in the first 2 years. Then 5. Then she lost count, because counting them was less important than doing them, and she was always better with the thing in front of her than the record of the things already done. Elias noticed one evening that the mail had become a substantial part of her week. He looked at the stack on the corner of her desk. His desk too now. They shared the office, which had required moving furniture and making peace with the fact that 2 people who both worked long hours would sometimes be working in the same room at the same time, and that was simply the shape of it. And he said, "You're building something beyond Blackstone." "Not intentionally," she said. "Most of what you build isn't intentional at the start. It's just the next thing that needs doing." She looked at the mail. He was right. which was irritating only in the way that correct observations are irritating when you hadn't gotten there first. "I don't know what to do with it yet," she said. "You'll figure it out." She did eventually. But that was a later chapter, and this one ends here. On the porch in the winter light, in the work-filled years that followed. In the morning she sat at her desk and looked at the accounts, and understood that what she was looking at was not just a mine's financial position, but the cumulative record of every decision she and Elias and Chen and Dunning and the men in the tunnels had made together. Hundreds of decisions, most of them unglamorous, all of them real. She had arrived in Colorado territory with a leather bag and a leather pouch of money, and the conviction that capability was worth something if you could get it in front of someone willing to see it. She had been wrong about one man and right about everything else, which was about the best ratio anyone could reasonably hope for. The mine ran. The accounts were clean. The mountain gave up its silver to people who had earned the right to ask for it. And the woman who had been told she was too independent to be worth anything looked at the life she had built from that rejection. The mine, the consortium, the partnership, the work that kept expanding past every boundary she set for it, and thought, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been completely and specifically proven right, good. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. There is something worth saying plainly, at the end of a story like this one. The world has always had people, not just women, but anyone who arrives somewhere without the expected credentials, without the right name or the right backing or the right kind of face, who are told, in various ways and with various degrees of politeness, that their independence is inconvenient, that their refusal to be smaller is a character flaw. The world has always been wrong about that. What Vivian Hartley understood, and what took her a long time to stop apologizing for, was that the capacity to see clearly, to look at a column of figures, or a complicated situation, or a room full of powerful men and understand exactly what was actually happening, was not a liability dressed up as a virtue. It was the thing itself, the core thing. And no one who has that particular kind of seeing owes the world a smaller version of it. The people who told her she was too much of something were really just telling her she was too much for them. Those are not the same statement, though they are often delivered as if they are. She built something anyway, with a man who was smart enough to know the difference. That is, in the end, the whole of it.